Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. The long dry years in medieval Anatolia. You find yourself standing in a small farming village in central Anatolia sometime in the late 13th century. The land stretches outward in muted shades of brown and pale green, broken by low hills and scattered scrub. The soil beneath your feet is hard, not yet cracked, but no longer soft enough to welcome a seed without effort. This is a place that depends almost entirely on the sky. There are no canals here. No engineered irrigation channels carry water from distant rivers. No pumps, no reservoirs carved with precision. What exists instead is a quiet dependence on seasonal rain and a long memory of how to endure when that rain does not come. The villagers do not yet call this a drought. At first, it is only a late rain. You notice how the people speak about the weather without urgency. They mention the delay casually, as if it were a minor inconvenience. "It will come," one man says, adjusting a wooden plow. Another shrugs, glancing at the horizon as though expecting clouds to gather simply because they should. But days pass, then weeks. The sky remains empty. The first adjustments. What you begin to observe is not panic, but adjustment, subtle at first, almost invisible unless you are looking closely. The fields are not planted all at once. Instead of sowing every available plot, the farmers divide their land. Some areas are left bare intentionally. You might assume this is neglect, but it is not. It is restraint, a calculation. If the rains fail entirely, better to lose part of the harvest than all of it. This practice, though not written down, has been learned over generations. It is a form of risk management, though no one here would use that phrase. They simply call it being careful. Seeds themselves are treated differently now. You notice how women in the village handle grain stores with unusual attention. Clay jars are sealed more tightly. Portions are set aside and not touched, even as daily meals grow slightly smaller. This is the first quiet rule of drought survival. Never consume what must become tomorrow's planting. Even when hunger begins to whisper, the seed grain remains sacred. Food becomes strategy. As the weeks stretch into months, the diet shifts. You might expect immediate scarcity, but what you see instead is substitution. Wheat, which requires more reliable moisture, is used more sparingly. In its place, barley becomes the staple. Barley is less demanding. It tolerates poor soil and uncertain rain better than wheat. You watch as meals become simpler. Flatbreads are thinner. Stews contain more lentils than grain. Wild plants once ignored begin to appear in cooking. Children are sent to gather herbs from the hillsides. Bitter greens, roots, and small edible weeds become part of daily life. These are not foods of preference, but of knowledge. Someone, long ago, learned which plants could sustain a person through lean times. That knowledge persists quietly, passed from one generation to the next. You begin to understand that survival here is not based on a single solution. It is a layering of small decisions. Water without technology. Without irrigation systems, water must be found, saved, or stretched. You notice shallow depressions in the land, natural basins where rainwater once collected. The villagers begin to clear these areas of debris, deepening them slightly by hand. It is not engineering in the formal sense, but it is intentional shaping of the land. When a rare rain does fall, even briefly, these basins capture what they can. Water is also stored in ceramic vessels, kept in the coolest parts of homes. You might think evaporation would make this ineffective, but the design of the containers actually allows for slight cooling, preserving the water longer than expected. There are also wells, though few and unreliable. Some have begun to dry. At one well, you watch as people lower buckets deeper than before. The rope creaks. The effort increases. Each drop of water now requires more labor than it did just a season ago. No one wastes it. Clothing is washed less often. Animals are watered carefully. Even cooking methods change. Foods that require less boiling are preferred. Water is no longer just a resource. It becomes a measure of time, effort, and survival. The role of animals. Livestock, too, become part of the equation. You notice that not all animals are kept. Some are sold or slaughtered earlier than usual. This might seem counterintuitive. Why reduce your resources during hardship? But the villagers understand something essential. Animals consume water and grain. In times of drought, too many animals can mean starvation for both humans and livestock. So decisions are made. A family might keep a single goat instead of 3. Sheep are prioritized over cattle as they require less water. Chickens are allowed to roam more freely, feeding themselves where possible. These choices are not made lightly. Each animal represents wealth, labor, and future security. Letting one go is not just a practical decision, it is an emotional one. You begin to sense the quiet weight of these choices. Social bonds under strain. As conditions worsen, the village does not immediately fracture. Instead, cooperation increases. Food is shared, though carefully. Labor is pooled. Families help one another harvest what little grows. There is an understanding, unspoken but firm, that survival depends on collective stability. But this balance is delicate. You notice small tensions, a glance held too long, a hesitation before sharing. The calculation of fairness becomes more precise as resources shrink. Still, for now, the system holds. Elders play a role here. They remember previous dry years. Their advice carries authority. They speak of patience, of endurance, of the importance of not abandoning the land too quickly. Because leaving is always an option. But it is also a risk. Migration as a last resort. Some families begin to consider moving. You overhear quiet conversations at night, discussions about distant regions where rain might still fall, rumors of better conditions elsewhere, stories, half-remembered, of relatives who once traveled and survived. But migration is not simple. To leave means abandoning fields, homes, and the fragile networks of support that exist within the village. It means entering uncertainty, where survival depends not on known strategies, but on chance. So most people stay. For now, faith and interpretation. In the absence of clear explanation, the drought is also understood through belief. You notice small changes in ritual. Prayers become more frequent. Gatherings at local religious sites increase. There is a sense that the drought is not just a natural event, but something that must be interpreted. Some see it as a test, others as a warning. You observe a communal prayer for rain. The entire village gathers. There is no guarantee it will work, but the act itself provides structure, a sense of doing something in the face of uncertainty. And perhaps that matters as much as the outcome. Time slows. As the drought continues, time begins to feel different. Without the usual cycle of planting, growing, and harvesting, days lose their rhythm. Work still exists, but it is less predictable, more reactive, more cautious. You notice how people spend longer periods simply waiting, watching the sky, listening for distant thunder that does not come. This waiting becomes its own form of labor. The first real signs of crisis. Eventually, the signs become harder to ignore. The soil begins to crack, not everywhere but in enough places to be noticed. Crops that were planted cautiously now struggle to reach maturity. Some fail entirely. Food stores shrink more quickly than expected. And the conversations change. Where once there was confidence the rain will come, there is now uncertainty. What if it does not? You feel the shift in tone. It is subtle but unmistakable. The village is moving from adjustment into something deeper, something more difficult. An unanswered question. You stand at the edge of a field, looking out over land that has sustained generations. The strategies you have observed, rationing, substitution, cooperation, restraint, have delayed disaster. But they have not ended the drought. And as the sky remains empty, a quiet question begins to take hold among the people, even if they do not speak it aloud. How long can these methods sustain life when the rains do not return at all? You remain in the village as the drought stretches beyond what anyone had first expected. What once felt like a delayed season now settles into something more permanent, more structural. The land itself begins to change in ways that are slow but undeniable, and you begin to understand that survival here is no longer about short-term adjustments. It is about endurance over an unknown length of time. The villagers stop speaking of when the rains return with certainty. Instead, they begin to speak in conditional phrases: if they return, or when they return, if God wills it. The difference is small, but it reflects a deeper shift in how they understand their situation. The soil begins to forget. At first, the concern was the absence of water. Now, you see that the land itself is beginning to suffer in more complex ways. Without regular moisture, the soil loses its structure. It becomes loose in some places, hardened in others. When the wind rises, and it often does across the Anatolian plateau, it lifts fine particles into the air, carrying away the most fertile layer almost invisibly. You might not notice it day by day, but over weeks and months, the fields become thinner, less capable of holding even the smallest amount of rain when it does arrive. This is something the villagers understand instinctively, even if they do not describe it in scientific terms. You see them placing stones along the edges of their fields, not as borders but as barriers to slow the wind. In some areas, they leave strips of land unplowed, allowing hardy grasses to grow. These strips act as anchors, holding the soil in place. It is a quiet form of land management, one that does not solve the drought, but attempts to prevent the land from deteriorating beyond recovery. Because they are not only trying to survive the present, they are trying to preserve the possibility of the future. Grain stores and difficult choices. Inside the homes, the grain jars grow lighter. You begin to notice how carefully they are opened now. A jar that once might have been dipped into freely is now approached with deliberation. Portions are measured. Meals are planned not just for the day, but for weeks ahead. There is no written accounting, but there is constant mental calculation. A mother pauses before scooping grain, estimating how many days remain before the next possible harvest, if there will be one at all. A father considers whether to reduce his own portion so that his children can eat slightly more. You begin to see a pattern. Adults eat less. Not dramatically at first, but gradually. It is a quiet redistribution of food within the household. And then, more difficult decisions emerge. Seed grain, once untouchable, is now reconsidered. You witness a conversation between two elders. One argues that eating the seed grain ensures survival now, even if it means there will be nothing to plant later. The other insists that without planting, there is no future at all. There is no clear answer. Some families hold firm, preserving their seeds despite growing hunger. Others begin to use small portions, hoping they can still retain enough to plant when the time comes. This divergence creates subtle differences in fate, though none of them can yet see how those choices will unfold. Water becomes labor. The wells continue to drop. You walk with a group of villagers before dawn, when the air is cooler and the effort of hauling water is slightly less exhausting. The journey to the nearest reliable well is longer now. Closer sources have dried or become too shallow to be useful. The path is worn smooth by repeated travel. You can sense how many times it has been walked in recent months. At the well, there is no conversation at first, only the sound of rope sliding against stone, buckets descending further than before. The process is slower. each person must wait longer for their turn. Water, once part of daily routine, has become a central task around which the day is organized. You notice how it affects everything else. Less time is available for tending fields, repairing homes, or resting. The energy spent simply acquiring water reduces the energy available for all other activities. And yet there is no alternative. Changing the rhythm of work. Agricultural work itself begins to shift in response to the conditions. Instead of large-scale planting, you see smaller, more concentrated efforts. Tiny plots are cultivated near areas where moisture might linger, shaded depressions, the edges of hills where runoff might collect, or near the rare surviving trees whose roots tap deeper water. These microfields are experimental in nature. No one expects them to produce abundant harvests, but even a small yield can make a difference. You watch as farmers plant seeds deeper than usual, hopping to reach residual moisture beneath the surface. It is a risky technique. If the seed is placed too deep, it may never sprout. Too shallow, and it will dry out. There is no guarantee, only experience guiding the decision. In some cases, crops are planted later than usual, in the faint hope that delayed rains might still arrive. This disrupts the traditional agricultural calendar, but the calendar itself has already been disrupted by the drought. Time, once predictable, is now uncertain. Foraging becomes knowledge. The surrounding landscape, once secondary to cultivated fields, becomes increasingly important. You begin to notice that certain individuals, often older women, hold detailed knowledge of wild plants. They know which roots can be dug even in dry soil, which leaves remain edible when others wither, and which plants must be avoided entirely. This knowledge is not written down. It exists in memory, passed through demonstration and repetition. Children follow these foragers, learning not through formal instruction, but through observation. They watch how a plant is identified, how it is harvested without damaging its ability to regrow, how it is prepared to remove bitterness or toxicity. In times of abundance, this knowledge might have seemed unnecessary. Now it becomes essential. You begin to realize that survival here depends not just on farming, but on a broader understanding of the environment, one that includes both cultivated and wild resources. The quiet departure of some. Despite the efforts to remain, some families begin to leave. You notice it gradually. A house stands empty. A field is left unattended. The absence is more noticeable than any announcement. Those who leave do not always say goodbye. There is a sense that departure is both a practical decision and a quiet acknowledgement of uncertainty. Where they are going is often unclear, even to themselves. You hear fragments of their plans moving toward regions rumored to have better rainfall, seeking work in towns, joining relatives in distant villages. For those who stay, each departure is a reminder of possibility and risk. It raises a difficult question. Is it wiser to endure or to abandon what you know? No one can answer it with certainty. Social structures under pressure. As resources continue to shrink, the cooperative systems within the village begin to strain. Sharing still occurs, but it becomes more conditional. Reciprocity is expected more strictly. Those who have slightly more are more cautious in how they distribute it. You notice small shifts in behavior. Conversations become shorter. Offers of help are weighed more carefully. Trust remains, but it is no longer effortless. At the same time, new forms of cooperation emerge. Groups form to share the labor of water collection. Families combine resources to cook communal meals, reducing fuel use and conserving supplies. It is not a breakdown, but a reconfiguration. The social fabric stretches, adapting to the pressure, but you can sense its limits. Faith, doubt, and persistence. Religious practices continue, but they evolve alongside the drought. Prayers for rain are still held, but there is a subtle change in tone. They are less about immediate relief and more about endurance, about strength to continue rather than certainty of change. You observe a gathering where an elder speaks, not of why the drought has come, but of how previous generations endured similar hardships. The focus shifts from explanation to continuity. This perspective offers a kind of stability. Even if the present is uncertain, the past suggests that survival is possible. And yet doubt exists alongside faith. You see it in the way people look at the sky not with expectation, but with a quiet questioning. The body reflects the land. As months pass, the effects of the drought become visible on the people themselves. Clothing hangs more loosely. Movements are slower. There is a careful conservation of energy in the way tasks are performed. Children, however, still play. Their games are quieter, less energetic, but they continue. It is a reminder that even in hardship, life does not entirely pause. Illness becomes more concerning. With limited nutrition and reduced water, recovery is slower. A minor ailment can linger, becoming something more serious. The villagers respond as they can using herbal remedies, adjusting diets where possible, relying on rest. But their options are limited. You begin to see how drought is not just an environmental condition. It is a gradual reshaping of every aspect of life. A season without harvest. Eventually, a realization settles over the village. There will be no meaningful harvest this year. Some crops have grown, but not enough to sustain the population through another cycle. What is gathered is carefully stored, but it is understood that it will not last indefinitely. This moment is not marked by a single event. There is no announcement. It is simply recognized quietly by everyone. And with that recognition comes a deeper uncertainty. Because now, survival is no longer about bridging a gap until the next harvest. It is about surviving without one. An unresolved tension. You stand once more at the edge of the village, watching as a small group prepares to leave at dawn. Their belongings are minimal, their destination uncertain. Behind you, others remain, continuing their routines, conserving what little they have, holding onto the possibility that endurance will be enough. Both choices carry risk. Both require a kind of faith either in the land or in the unknown beyond it. And as the drought continues, a more pressing question begins to take shape, one that no strategy so far has fully answered. What happens when endurance itself begins to fail not just in the land, but in the people who depend on it? You remain in the village as the drought enters what feels like its final, most uncertain phase. By now, time has lost much of its familiar structure. The seasons still pass, but they no longer bring the changes that once defined them. There is no clear beginning or end to the agricultural year, only a continuation of dryness, punctuated by brief and often disappointing moments of hope. And yet life persists. Not in the way it once did, with predictable rhythms and modest abundance, but in a quieter, more deliberate form. What you are witnessing now is not simply survival. It is adaptation under pressure, shaped by limits that are becoming increasingly visible. When endurance becomes decision, the question that once lingered whether to stay or to leave can no longer be postponed. You see it in the way families gather at night, speaking in low voices. These are no longer speculative conversations. They are decisions being made, often with incomplete information and no guarantee of success. Some choose to leave. Their departure is more organized now than before. They travel in small groups rather than alone, combining their limited resources. There is a sense that cooperation, even beyond the village, might improve their chances. You watch as they prepare, selecting only what can be carried, leaving behind objects that once defined their daily lives: tools, pottery, even parts of their homes. These items are not abandoned lightly, but necessity demands it. For those who remain, the decision is equally deliberate. They choose to stay not because it is easier, but because it is known. They understand the land, even in its diminished state. They know where small amounts of water can still be found, where certain plants continue to grow, where the soil might still yield something under the right conditions. Staying becomes an act of commitment to place, to memory, and to the possibility that the land can still sustain them. The final use of stored knowledge. At this stage, survival depends almost entirely on accumulated knowledge. You begin to notice how even the smallest details matter. A particular slope that retains moisture slightly longer than others. A patch of earth where seeds, if planted at just the right depth, might still germinate. A rarely used path that leads to a seasonal spring, now reduced but not entirely dry. These fragments of knowledge, once peripheral, now form the core of daily life. You observe a group of villagers working together on a narrow strip of land at the base of a hill. It is not an obvious place to farm, but runoff from rare, brief rains collects there. The soil is slightly darker, slightly more forgiving. They plant carefully, spacing seeds further apart than usual to reduce competition for what little moisture exists. There is no expectation of abundance, only the hope of enough. This is what survival looks like now, not growth but precision. The role of memory and story. As physical resources decline, another kind of resource becomes more visible: memory. You hear stories more often now. Not elaborate tales, but simple accounts of past droughts, of years when conditions were similar, and of how people endured. An elder describes a time, decades earlier, when rains failed for 2 consecutive years. He speaks of how the village reduced its herds, relied more heavily on wild plants, and survived until the rains returned. These stories are not told for comfort alone. They are practical. They contain strategies, warnings, and patterns that might still apply. You begin to understand that history in this context is not distant. It is a tool. It provides a framework for interpreting the present, even when the present feels unprecedented. The return of rain, but not relief. And then one day, the sky changes. Clouds gather, not the thin, passing kind you have seen before, but dense and sustained. The air shifts. There is a stillness that feels different from the quiet of drought. When the rain finally comes, it is not gentle. It falls heavily, striking the hardened ground with force. You might expect relief, even celebration, but what you witness is more complicated. The soil, having lost its structure, struggles to absorb the water. Instead, much of it runs off, carrying loose earth with it. Small channels form, cutting through fields that had already been weakened. The basins the villagers had prepared capture some of the water, but not enough. The rain, though long awaited, arrives in a form that the land is no longer fully able to receive. There is gratitude, certainly, but also a quiet recognition. This rain does not undo what has been lost. Planting again carefully. Despite the challenges, the villagers begin to plant again. The preserved seed grain, what remains of it, is brought out. Each handful represents not just food, but possibility. You notice how cautiously it is used. Fields are still not fully planted. The memory of loss remains fresh, guiding decisions even as conditions improve. The techniques developed during the drought persist. Seeds are spaced more carefully. Marginal lands are still utilized. Water, though more available, is not treated casually. It becomes clear that the drought has changed not just the land, but the approach to farming itself. Even as the environment begins to recover, the mindset of scarcity remains. Those who left and those who return. Over time, some of those who left begin to return. Not all and not immediately. Some have found new places to settle. Others were unable to survive the journey or the conditions elsewhere. But a few come back. They arrive with different experiences, stories of other regions, other strategies, other hardships. These experiences, in turn, become part of the village's collective knowledge. For those who stayed, their survival has reinforced their connection to the land. For those who left and returned, their perspective has expanded. The village is not the same as it was before the drought. It is smaller in some ways, but it is also more complex. A landscape marked by absence. As life stabilizes, the signs of the drought remain visible. Fields that once produced reliably now show uneven growth. Some areas have been abandoned entirely, their soil too degraded to recover quickly. Certain wells never refill. And there are absences that are harder to measure, families who never returned, knowledge that may have been lost with those who carried it. You walk through the village and sense these gaps not as dramatic losses, but as quiet omissions in the pattern of daily life. What endures? And yet much has endured. The practices developed during the drought: rationing, diversification of food sources, careful water management do not disappear. They become part of normal life, even when conditions improve. The villagers do not return to their previous habits entirely. They have seen what happens when the rains fail, and that knowledge shapes their choices moving forward. Children who grew up during the drought carry these lessons with them. What was once considered exceptional becomes, for them, a baseline understanding of how the world can behave. In this way, the drought extends beyond its physical duration. It becomes embedded in behavior, in expectation, in memory. A quiet reflection. As you step back from the village, you begin to see the broader pattern. There was no single solution to the drought, no invention or discovery that resolved it. Survival came instead from a combination of small, deliberate actions, each one insufficient on its own, but together forming a system of endurance. You saw how people adjusted their diets, managed their resources, altered their farming practices, and relied on shared knowledge. You saw how social structures adapted, strained, and reformed. You saw how decisions whether to stay or to leave shaped individual and collective outcomes. And perhaps most importantly, you saw how survival depended not just on the environment, but on the ability to interpret and respond to it. A thought that remains. Now, as the rains return and life begins to stabilize, a question lingers not just for this village, but for any society that depends so closely on the natural world. When the next drought comes, as it inevitably will these lessons be remembered, or slowly forgotten as conditions improve? Story 2, Waiting for the Nile, Egyptian Fellahin and the Low Floods. You find yourself standing on the banks of the Nile in medieval Egypt, sometime during the later centuries of the Islamic caliphates. The river stretches wide before you, its surface calm, almost indifferent. It is not a wild river. It does not rush or roar. Instead, it moves with a slow certainty, as though it has always known its path. Everything here depends on it. Unlike the farmers you observed in Anatolia, these villagers fellahin, as they are known, do not rely on rainfall. Rain is rare in this land, almost irrelevant. What matters instead is the annual flood of the Nile, a phenomenon so regular that it has shaped not only agriculture, but time itself. The year is not divided by seasons of temperature, but by the river's behavior, its rise, its peak, and its retreat. And yet this year, something is wrong. The measurement of uncertainty. You are led to a structure along the riverbank, a simple but precise instrument used for generations, the nilometer. It consists of marked columns or steps descending into the water, allowing officials and local observers to measure the river's height. These measurements are not abstract numbers. They determine everything: how much land will be irrigated, how much grain will grow, how much tax will be collected. You watch as a man leans over the edge, noting the water level. His expression remains controlled, but there is a subtle tension in his posture. The flood has come, but it has not risen enough. There is no immediate alarm, no sudden reaction. Instead, the information spreads slowly, carried in quiet conversations. The water is low this year. At first, it sounds like a simple observation, but you begin to understand its implications. A low flood means that the water will not reach as far across the floodplain. Fields that depend on inundation will remain dry. Silt, the rich, dark sediment that replenishes the soil, will not be deposited in sufficient quantities. It is not just a matter of less water. It is a matter of less fertility, less growth, less life. A system without machines. You might assume that a civilization so closely tied to a river would have elaborate irrigation systems to compensate for such fluctuations. And indeed, there are canals, basins, and simple lifting devices like the shaduf. But these are limited in scope. They depend on the flood itself. Without sufficient water entering the system, even the canals run shallow. The shaduf, a hand-operated device used to lift water from the river to higher ground, requires labor and time, and it cannot compensate for a significantly reduced flood across large areas. In other words, the system is not designed to replace the flood. It is designed to distribute it. And when the flood is weak, distribution becomes a problem of scarcity. The basin fields. You walk through the agricultural lands just beyond the riverbank. The fields are organized into basin systems, large, enclosed plots surrounded by earthen walls. In a normal year, floodwaters are allowed to enter these basins, where they remain for several weeks. The water slowly soaks into the soil, depositing silt and providing moisture for the growing season. But this year, many basins remain only partially filled. You can see the difference clearly. Some fields hold shallow water, barely covering the surface. Others are dry entirely, their cracked earth a stark contrast to the expected dark, wet soil. The farmers move through these fields, assessing the situation. There is no panic, only observation. They already understand what this means. Adjusting to less. The first response is not dramatic, it is careful. Farmers begin by prioritizing certain plots over others. Fields closer to the river, where water levels are slightly higher, are given preference. Those further away may be left unplanted, much like the Anatolian farmers you observed earlier. But here, the decision is shaped by the structure of the basin system. Water must be directed, controlled, and sometimes withheld from one area to benefit another. You watch as small channels are opened or blocked, guiding the limited water into specific basins. These decisions are often communal, involving multiple families whose fields are connected. There is negotiation involved. Who receives water and who does not? The answers are not always fair, but they are rarely random. The role of authority. Unlike the village in Anatolia, where decisions were largely local, here there is a layer of authority. Officials monitor the flood levels and, in some cases, attempt to regulate water distribution. Tax assessments are also tied to these measurements, though in years of low flood, adjustments may be made. You hear discussions about whether taxes will be reduced this year. For the fellahin, this is not a minor concern. A poor harvest combined with unchanged taxes can lead to debt, loss of land, or worse. But the system is not always responsive. There are delays, disagreements, uncertainty about how severe the shortfall will be. In the meantime, the farmers must act based on what they can see, the water in their fields or the lack of it. Crops and calculation. The choice of crops becomes critical. In a good year, a variety of grains and vegetables might be planted, but in a year of low flood, diversity gives way to caution. You see farmers choosing crops that require less water or have shorter growing cycles. Barley, once again, becomes important. It is more tolerant of limited moisture than wheat. Some fields are planted later than usual, in the hope that residual moisture might sustain them. Others are planted more sparsely, reducing competition between plants. There is no guarantee that these adjustments will succeed, but they increase the chances of obtaining at least some yield. And in a year like this, some is enough to matter. Labor intensifies. As water becomes less available, labor increases. You watch as farmers use the shadow to lift water from the river into channels that feed their fields. The process is repetitive and physically demanding. Each bucket of water must be raised by hand, using a counterweighted pole. In a normal year, this method supplements the flood. In a low flood year, it becomes a primary tool. But it has limits. You can see it in the pace of the workers, the slow, steady rhythm, the need to rest frequently, the realization that no matter how much effort is applied, only a limited area can be sustained this way. Water, once delivered passively by the river, now requires continuous human effort. Food and storage. Inside the homes, the pattern you observed in Anatolia repeats in a different form. Grain stores are examined carefully, portions are reduced slightly, meals become more predictable, less varied. But there is an important difference here. In Egypt, storage systems are often more developed. Granaries, both private and state-controlled, exist to buffer against fluctuations. These reserves do not eliminate hardship, but they delay it. You hear discussions about how long the stored grain might last. Calculations are made not just at the household level, but across the community. There is a sense that the system, though strained, still provides some protection. At least for now. The psychological weight of waiting. Unlike drought in a rain-fed region, where the absence of rain is continuous and visible, the Nile's cycle creates a different kind of tension. The flood has already happened. There is no more waiting for water to arrive. Instead, there is waiting to see the consequences of what has already occurred. You notice how this shapes behavior. There is less watching of the sky and more watching of the fields, less speculation about weather and more concern about growth. Will the crops survive with the moisture they have received? Will there be enough to harvest? The uncertainty is quieter, but no less significant. A subtle unease. As weeks pass, the reality of the low flood begins to settle in. The fields that were planted show uneven growth. Some areas appear healthy enough, while others struggle. The difference between success and failure can be measured in small distances, just a few steps from one patch of soil to another. You begin to sense a growing unease. Not fear exactly, not yet, but an awareness that the margin for error is shrinking. An unanswered question. You stand once more by the Nile, watching its steady flow. It looks unchanged, almost generous in its width and movement. And yet, you now understand how deceptive that appearance can be. Because everything depends not on the presence of the river, but on how much it gives. And this year, it has given less. As the growing season unfolds, a quiet question takes shape among the farmers, one that will determine not just this harvest, but the months that follow. If the river does not rise higher next year, what happens when the reserves of grain, of labor, of patience begin to run out? You remain along the Nile as the consequences of the low flood begin to unfold in full. Unlike a sudden disaster, nothing here collapses all at once. Instead, the effects move slowly through the system, through the soil, through the crops, through the bodies of the people who depend on them. At first, the fields offer a kind of cautious optimism. Some crops do grow. Not evenly and not abundantly, but enough to suggest that the year will not be a complete failure. You walk through the basin fields and see patches of green thin, uneven, but alive. Farmers move carefully between them, inspecting each section as if reading a quiet message written in the soil. But as weeks pass, the limitations of the low flood become clearer. The uneven harvest. Harvest time arrives without ceremony. In a typical year, It would bring a steady rhythm of cutting, gathering, and storing. There would be a sense of completion, a cycle fulfilled. But this year, the harvest feels fragmented. Some basins produce modest yields, others produce almost nothing. You watch as a farmer cuts barley from a narrow strip of land that received just enough water. A few steps away, another field lies nearly barren. The difference is not dramatic from a distance, but up close it is decisive. This unevenness creates a new kind of challenge. It is not simply that there is less food, it is that the distribution of that food is irregular. Some families will have enough to last for a time. Others will face shortage almost immediately. And this imbalance begins to shape the social fabric in subtle ways. Storage as a shield and a limit. Grain is brought into storage with care. You notice how every step of the process is deliberate. The harvested stalks are dried thoroughly. The grains are separated and cleaned. Storage containers are checked for cracks or weaknesses. Even the placement of the jars away from heat, away from pests, is considered carefully. Nothing can be wasted. For those who have harvested enough, storage provides a sense of temporary security, but it is not a solution. It is a delay. You begin to hear more precise calculations now, not just how much grain is available, but how long it will last under different conditions. If we eat this much each day, it will last until the next flood. If we reduce further, perhaps longer. But these calculations depend on assumptions that the next flood will be sufficient, that no additional hardship will intervene. And those assumptions are uncertain. The expansion of labor. With limited harvests, the role of labor expands beyond the fields. You see more people engaged in tasks that might once have been secondary. Fishing along the Nile becomes more frequent. Nets are repaired and cast with greater attention. Even small catches are valued. You also notice increased activity in gathering materials, reeds for weaving, mud for construction, anything that can be used to produce goods for trade. Because trade, though limited, becomes more important. Some families begin to exchange small items, crafted tools, woven baskets, preserved foods in return for grain or other necessities. These exchanges are modest, often informal, but they represent an effort to redistribute resources beyond the immediate household. Labor in this context becomes a form of currency. The weight of obligation. At the same time, the presence of authority becomes more pronounced. Tax collection, though sometimes adjusted in years of low flood, does not disappear. Officials still move through the region, assessing what can be taken, what must be left. You observe these interactions carefully. There is negotiation, but it is constrained. Farmers may argue that their yields were low, that their fields did not receive enough water. Officials may acknowledge this, but they also operate within a system that expects a certain level of revenue. The result is often compromise, but not always a fair one. For some families, the obligation to pay taxes forces difficult choices. Grain that might have been stored for survival is instead surrendered. Debts begin to form, sometimes quietly, sometimes formally. You begin to see how drought, or in this case, low flood, is not only an environmental event. It is also shaped by systems of governance, by expectations that persist even when conditions change. Food becomes measured time. Meals become more structured. You notice how portions are no longer determined by appetite, but by calculation. A bowl of grain is measured not just for today, but for the days ahead. Cooking methods shift slightly. Foods that can be stretched porridges, stews become more common. Ingredients are combined in ways that maximize volume, even if they reduce richness or flavor. There is less waste. Leftovers, once incidental, are now intentional. And yet, there is an effort to maintain normalcy. Families still gather to eat. Conversations continue. There is no visible panic at the table, but beneath the routine, you can sense the constant awareness of limits. Each meal is part of a larger equation. The second year's uncertainty. As the year progresses, attention turns once again to the river. The next flood will determine everything. You begin to notice a shift in how people observe the Nile. The calm acceptance you saw before has been replaced by a more focused attention. Every small change in water level is noted. Every report from upstream regions is discussed. There are rumors. Some say the waters are already rising more strongly this year. Others claim the opposite. Information travels slowly, and it is not always reliable. But it matters, because the reserves of grain, of energy, of patience are already diminished. A second low flood would not simply repeat the hardship. It would deepen it, pushing the system closer to its limits. Community under quiet pressure. The uneven harvest begins to affect relationships within the community. Those who have slightly more are approached more often for loans, for exchanges, for assistance. Some respond with generosity, remembering that they too may need help in the future. Others become more cautious. You notice how these interactions are handled with care. Requests are made indirectly, often framed as temporary arrangements rather than outright need. There is an effort to preserve dignity, to avoid open acknowledgement of hardship. But the pressure is there. You see it in the way conversations pause, in the way decisions take longer, in the way trust is both relied upon and tested. Adaptation without certainty. Despite all of this, the fellahin continue to adapt. You see small innovations, adjustments to basin walls to better retain water, slight changes in planting patterns, experiments with different crop combinations. None of these changes are dramatic. They are incremental, built on observation and experience. And yet they represent something important, a refusal to remain passive. Even in a system so dependent on the Nile, there is room for human response. Limited, yes, but not absent. The body and the mind. As the months pass, the effects of the reduced harvest become more visible. Energy levels decline slightly. Work continues, but at a more measured pace. Rest becomes more important, though not always possible. You also notice changes in mood, not overt despair, but a kind of quiet vigilance. People are more attentive, more deliberate in their actions. Children still play, but their games are shorter, less intense. Adults speak more often about practical matters, food, water, the river, than about anything else. Life continues, but it is shaped by awareness. A moment before the next flood. Eventually, the time approaches when the Nile will begin to rise again. The air feels different. There is a subtle shift, something in the atmosphere, in the behavior of the river itself. You stand once more at the edge of the water, watching. Around you, others gather, not in large numbers but enough to suggest shared attention. No one speaks loudly. There is no ceremony. Just observation. Because this moment carries weight. The previous year has shown what happens when the flood is insufficient. The current stores of grain, the condition of the fields, the resilience of the people all now depend on what the river will do next. An unresolved tension. As the first signs of rising water appear, hope and uncertainty exist side by side. If the flood is strong, recovery is possible. Fields can be replenished. Grain stores can be rebuilt. The system can stabilize. But if the flood is low again, you do not hear anyone finish that thought aloud. It remains unspoken but present. And as the water begins its slow, measured rise, a question settles quietly over the riverbank, shared by all who depend on it. How much strain can a system endure when its balance is tested not once, but again and again? You remain by the Nile as the new flood season begins, and this time, the atmosphere feels heavier not because of what is visible, but because of what is remembered. The previous year has already altered expectations. Where once the rising of the river was a reliable reassurance, it is now something to be watched with quiet scrutiny. The fellahin do not gather in celebration. They observe in silence, measuring, comparing, remembering. Because this flood is no longer just part of a cycle. It is a test. The slow rise. At first, the river behaves much as it always has. The water begins to climb gradually, inch by inch against the marked stones of the nilometer. Officials return to their posts, recording the levels with practiced attention. Their work has not changed, but the meaning behind the numbers has. You stand near the measuring point again, noticing how many more eyes are fixed on the water this time. The readings are shared quietly among those gathered nearby. It is higher than last year, someone says. But not by much. The increase is real, but modest. It does not bring immediate relief, only cautious consideration. A slightly higher flood might improve conditions, but it may not be enough to restore what was lost. You begin to understand that recovery is not a single event. It is a process, dependent on degrees rather than absolutes. Water reaches the basins. As the river continues to rise, water is guided once again into the basin fields. You walk along the earthen embankments as farmers open channels, allowing the floodwaters to enter. The process is familiar, but the reactions are more measured. In some basins, the water reaches a level that feels adequate, covering the soil, settling into place. In others, it remains shallow, echoing the previous year's insufficiency. The difference between these basins matters. You notice how closely they are monitored. Farmers return repeatedly, checking the depth, the spread, the retention. They make small adjustments where possible, reinforcing walls, redirecting flow. This is not passive irrigation. It is active management, even within the limits of a natural system. Silt in its absence. One of the less visible but deeply important aspects of the flood is the silt it carries. In strong flood years, the Nile deposits a rich layer of dark sediment across the fields. This natural fertilization restores nutrients to the soil, supporting healthy crops. But after a low flood, the amount of silt is reduced. You see this clearly now. In some areas, the soil retains its familiar dark tone. In others, it appears lighter, thinner, less substantial. Farmers notice this immediately. They know that even if water reaches the fields, the lack of sufficient silt will affect the strength of the next harvest. Crops may grow, but not as robustly. Yields may improve, but not fully recover. The land, like the people, carries the memory of the previous year. Planting with caution. When the floodwaters begin to recede, planting resumes. But it is different now. You notice how carefully the seeds are distributed. There is no return to the fuller planting patterns of better years. Instead, the restraint learned during the low flood persists. Fields are still partially left unplanted. Seeds are spaced deliberately. Crop choices remain conservative. Barley continues to dominate, with limited experimentation beyond what is considered safe. It becomes clear that recovery does not erase caution. The fellahin are not simply responding to current conditions. They are responding to the possibility that those conditions could change again. The first signs of improvement. As weeks pass, there are signs, small but meaningful, that conditions are improving. The crops, though not uniform, show more consistency than the previous year. Green stretches across the fields with fewer interruptions. The difference is not dramatic, but it is visible. You watch as farmers move through their fields with a slightly different posture. There is still vigilance, but also a quiet acknowledgement that this year may be better. Not good, perhaps, but better. And in this context, that distinction matters deeply. Recovery is uneven. Despite these improvements, recovery does not occur equally. Some families, particularly those whose fields received sufficient water both this year and last, begin to stabilize more quickly. Their grain stores, though reduced, can be replenished gradually. Others remain in a more precarious position. Families who lost most of their harvest in the previous year, or who were required to give up significant portions in taxes, do not recover as easily. Even with a slightly better flood, they are starting from a lower point. You see how this creates subtle differences within the community. Not divisions, exactly, but variations in security, in confidence, in outlook. Some speak cautiously of rebuilding. Others remain focused on immediate survival. The role of memory in decision-making. What stands out most is how memory shapes behavior. The low flood has not been forgotten, and it influences every decision. Grain, even when more abundant, is stored with the same care as before. Water, though more available, is not wasted. Labor is still directed with efficiency, avoiding unnecessary effort. You begin to realize that the experience of scarcity has created a lasting change. Even as conditions improve, the mindset of conservation remains. This is not simply caution, it is adaptation. Authority and adjustment. The role of authority continues to influence the outcome. With a somewhat improved flood, tax expectations begin to shift again. Officials may assume that yields will increase and adjust their demands accordingly. But the farmers know that recovery is incomplete. You observe the tension in these interactions. Farmers argue for leniency, pointing to the lingering effects of the previous year. Officials weigh these claims against their own obligations. The system adjusts, but not always perfectly. And so, the process of recovery is shaped not only by the river, but by the structures that govern its use. A return to routine, but not the same. As the season progresses, daily life begins to resemble its earlier patterns once more. Fields are tended regularly, meals become slightly more substantial, conversations extend beyond immediate concerns. But something has changed. The ease that once accompanied these routines is gone. In its place is an awareness, a recognition that stability is conditional, that abundance can diminish, that the river, though reliable, is not guaranteed. You sense this in the way people work, in the way they store, in the way they speak about the future. What was learned? Looking back over the 2 years, you can see how survival was not dependent on a single factor. It was not just the river, though the river was central. It was also the ability to adjust, to reduce planting, to conserve resources, to rely on storage, to adapt labor, to negotiate social and political structures. The Fellahin did not control the Nile, but they understood how to live within its fluctuations. And that understanding made the difference. A quiet ending and a lingering thought. You stand once more by the river, watching as it flows steadily past, much as it did when you first arrived. To an outside observer, it might seem unchanged. But you know that beneath this surface continuity lies a complex system of adaptation, one that has been tested, strained, and adjusted over time. The low flood did not destroy the community, but it reshaped it. And as you turn away, one thought remains, one that extends beyond this place and time. In a world where survival depends on natural cycles, how much of resilience comes from the environment itself, and how much from the quiet, accumulated knowledge of the people who learn to live within its limits? Story 3. Dust and Survival in Ming Dynasty, Northern China. You find yourself in northern China during the era of the Ming Dynasty, standing at the edge of a village pressed between cultivated land and the wide, open expanse of the Les Plateau. The earth here is unlike the soils you have seen before. It is fine, almost powdery, a pale yellow that lifts easily under your feet. This land was built by wind. Over centuries, dust carried from distant deserts settled here, layer upon layer, forming deep deposits that can be carved almost like soft stone. It is fertile when conditions are right, remarkably so, but it is also fragile. And now it is dry, a landscape of uncertainty. Unlike the Nile Valley, where water flows predictably, or Anatolia, where rainfall, though uncertain, still defines the seasons, this region exists between extremes. Rain does come, but irregularly. Some years bring enough to sustain crops, others bring too little or none at all. The timing matters as much as the amount. A late rain can be as damaging as no rain. You stand in a field that has already been prepared for planting. The soil has been loosened, broken into fine particles that would normally absorb and hold moisture. But without rain, that preparation begins to work against itself. The loosened earth dries quickly, and when the wind rises, as it often does, it carries the soil away. You watch as a gust moves across the field, lifting a thin veil of dust into the air. It is not dramatic. It does not obscure the landscape entirely, but it is steady, persistent. A slow loss. The first signs of a dry year. The villagers do not need official measurements to understand what is happening. They read the signs in smaller details. The winter snow was thin. The spring thaw brought little moisture. The early rains, which should have softened the ground, did not arrive. You hear these observations spoken quietly, almost as routine conversation. It was a light snow this year. The ground did not hold the melt. The wind came early. Each statement carries weight, even if it is delivered calmly. By the time planting season arrives, the conclusion is already forming. This may be a dry year. Farming on the edge. The farmers here rely on a method that, at first glance, seems simple. They plant crops millet, sorghum, sometimes wheat, in hope that seasonal rains will sustain them. But as you observe more closely, you begin to see the complexity beneath that simplicity. Fields are not planted uniformly. Instead, they are arranged with subtle variations, slight ridges, shallow depressions, uneven spacing. These are not mistakes. They are intentional. The ridges help slow the movement of water when it does fall, allowing it to soak into the soil rather than run off. The depressions collect moisture, creating small pockets where crops have a better chance of survival. Even the direction of the rows matters. They are often aligned to reduce the impact of prevailing winds, minimizing soil loss. These techniques do not require machinery. They rely on observation, memory, and repeated practice. The role of millet. You notice that millet dominates the fields. This is not by chance. Millet is well suited to dry conditions. It grows quickly, requires less water than many other grains, and can tolerate poor soil. Its roots penetrate deeply, accessing moisture that lies beyond the surface. For the villagers, millet is not just a crop, it is a form of insurance. In better years, other grains might be preferred for their taste or yield. But in uncertain conditions, millet becomes central. You watch as seeds are planted carefully, spaced to reduce competition for limited moisture. Each seed represents a calculated risk. Too close together, and they will compete and fail. Too far apart, and the land is underused. There is no perfect solution, only balance. Water without rivers. Unlike the Nile, there is no great river to draw from. Unlike regions with wells that reach stable groundwater, much of this area depends on surface moisture. And yet water is still found. You are led to a series of shallow pits dug into the earth. At first, they seem insignificant small depressions, barely noticeable, but these are designed to capture and hold rainwater when it falls. Some are lined with compacted soil to reduce seepage. Others are placed strategically at the base of slopes, where runoff naturally collects. In addition, you see evidence of early forms of water storage, ceramic vessels buried partially in the ground, where evaporation is slower. These are not large reserves, but they provide small, crucial supplies during dry periods. Water here is not abundant, but it is managed. Carefully, deliberately, and always with awareness of its limits. Living with wind. The wind is constant. It shapes not only the land, but the daily behavior of the people who live here. You notice how homes are built partially into the less cliffs, creating sheltered spaces that protect against both wind and temperature extremes. These dwellings, known as yaedongs, remain cooler in summer and warmer in winter. Fields, too, are designed with wind in mind. Trees, where they exist, are left standing as natural barriers. In some areas, shrubs are cultivated along the edges of fields to reduce soil loss. Even daily activities are adjusted. Tasks that involve loose materials thrashing, drying grain are timed to avoid the strongest winds. The environment is not resisted directly. It is accommodated. Food and flexibility. Inside the village, you observe how food practices reflect the uncertainty of the land. Grain is stored, but not in large centralized granaries. Instead, it is distributed among households, each maintaining its own reserves. This decentralization has advantages. It reduces the risk of total loss from pests, theft, or structural failure. But it also means that each family must manage its own survival. Meals are simple millet porridge, flatbreads, occasionally supplemented with vegetables or preserved foods. Meat is rare, reserved for special occasions or necessity. You notice how food is stretched. Porridge is made thinner. Ingredients are combined in ways that maximize volume. Nothing is wasted. And yet, there is a quiet acceptance of this simplicity. It is not seen as deprivation, but as normal. Community and constraint. The village operates with a degree of cooperation, but also with clear boundaries. Labor is sometimes shared, particularly during planting and harvest. Knowledge is exchanged about which fields are performing better, which techniques seem to help. But resources are largely managed at the household level. This creates a balance between cooperation and independence. In times of moderate difficulty, this system works well. Families support one another without losing their autonomy. But you begin to wonder what will happen if conditions worsen. Because independence, while valuable, can also mean that some households are more vulnerable than others. The sky remains empty. As days pass, the expected rains do not arrive. The sky remains clear, a pale, unbroken expanse. The air grows drier. The soil, already fragile, begins to lose what little moisture it held. You walk through the fields again and notice changes. Seeds that should have sprouted remain dormant or have failed entirely. In some areas, small shoots have emerged, only to wither before reaching strength. The wind continues its quiet work, lifting fine particles from the surface. The land is not collapsing. It is thinning. Early adjustments. The farmers respond, as they always do, incrementally. Some fields are abandoned early, their potential already judged too low to justify further effort. Labor is redirected to areas with slightly better conditions. In other fields, attempts are made to conserve what little moisture remains. The soil is lightly compacted in places, reducing evaporation. Small barriers are created to trap drifting soil, preserving what remains of the top layer. These actions are subtle, almost invisible from a distance, but they represent a continuous process of adjustment. The weight of expectation. You begin to sense a familiar pattern, the same quiet awareness you observed in Anatolia, the same measured concern you saw along the Nile. The villagers are not surprised by hardship. They expect it to a degree. But expectation does not eliminate difficulty. As the dry conditions persist, a question begins to take shape, not spoken openly, but present in the way people work, in the way they look at the sky, in the way they measure their remaining grain. How long can the land give anything at all, when both water and soil are slowly slipping away together? You remain in the village as the dry year settles into something more defined. What began as a suspicion thin snow, absent rains, has now become a condition that shapes every decision. The fields no longer carry the quiet promise of growth. Instead, they reflect uncertainty. And here, in this landscape of fine, wind-shaped earth, uncertainty is not only about water. It is about whether the land itself can remain in place long enough to support life. When the crops fail to establish, you walk through the planted fields again, but now the changes are unmistakable. In some areas, seeds never germinated. The soil above them dried too quickly, forming a thin crust that prevented shoots from breaking through. In other places, fragile sprouts emerged briefly, only to wither under the combined stress of wind and dryness. You notice how uneven the land has become, not in elevation, but in potential. A few patches still hold faint traces of green, usually where the soil is slightly deeper or better sheltered. But these patches are exceptions. Most of the fields are quiet. Not barren, exactly, but inactive. The farmers do not waste time mourning this. They have already begun to adjust. Abandonment as strategy. One of the first clear decisions you observe is the deliberate abandonment of certain fields. This is not neglect, it is calculation. Continuing to work a failing field consumes energy that could be directed elsewhere. So the farmers choose which plots to maintain and which to leave behind. The criteria are subtle. Fields that are more exposed to wind are often the first to be abandoned. Those with slightly better soil depth, or those located in natural depressions, are prioritized. You see families shifting their efforts, concentrating labor where there is still a possibility, however small, of return. This selective focus does not solve the problem, but it prevents the complete exhaustion of effort. The fight against wind. As the drought continues, the role of wind becomes more pronounced. Without moisture to bind it, the soil becomes increasingly vulnerable. You begin to notice small but persistent movements of earth-fine particles drifting across the surface, collecting in low areas, thinning in others. The villagers respond with what means they have. You see them placing lines of brush, stones, and even crop residue across their fields. These barriers are not large, but they interrupt the wind's movement, causing it to drop some of the soil it carries. In some places, they create low ridges, raised lines of earth that act as both windbreaks and moisture traps. These techniques require time and labor, both of which are limited. But they represent an important shift. The farmers are no longer only trying to grow crops. They are trying to keep the land itself from disappearing. Digging for moisture. Water, though scarce, is still sought. You are shown areas where the soil has been dug deeper than usual, not for planting, but to reach layers that might still retain moisture. These deeper pockets are used for small-scale planting, often with reduced expectations. You also notice that planting depth changes. Seeds are placed slightly deeper in the ground, where moisture lingers longer. But this is a delicate balance. Too deep, and the seed may not have the strength to reach the surface. Too shallow, and it dries before it can grow. Each decision is made without certainty, guided only by experience and observation. Food beyond the fields. As cultivated crops fail, attention turns increasingly to other sources of food. You follow a group moving beyond the village into the surrounding hills. They search for edible plants, roots, hardy grasses, wild seeds. This is not foraging in the sense of abundance. It is careful collection. Each plant is examined. Only those known to be safe are taken. Quantities are small, but they accumulate over time. You also see increased reliance on stored foods, dried vegetables, preserved grains from previous years, anything that can extend the available supply. In some cases, even less desirable foods are reconsidered. Plants that would normally be ignored are used, prepared in ways that reduce bitterness or toxicity. Knowledge becomes as important as availability. The structure of storage. Inside the homes, storage takes on greater importance. You observe how grain is handled with almost ritual care. Containers are checked repeatedly. Any sign of spoilage or pests is addressed immediately. Portions are reduced further. Meals become more predictable, more controlled. There is less variation, less flexibility. Each household develops its own rhythm of consumption, balancing need against supply. You begin to see how time is measured not by days or weeks, but by remaining stores. How long will this last? It is a question that is constantly present, even when not spoken. Labor becomes scarce. As food intake decreases, energy follows. You notice how work patterns change. Tasks are performed more slowly, with deliberate packing. Rest periods become longer, though not always sufficient. There is a visible effort to conserve strength, to avoid unnecessary movement. This creates a difficult situation. The conditions require more labor, more effort to manage soil, to gather food, to maintain water supplies. But the ability to provide that labor is diminishing. It is a quiet imbalance, one that grows over time. Household differences emerge. Not all families experience the drought in the same way. Some entered the season with slightly larger grain reserves. Others had better positioned fields or more members able to contribute labor. These differences, once minor, begin to expand. You notice how some households maintain a degree of stability while others face increasing strain. The gap is not dramatic, but it is noticeable. And it influences behavior. Those with more become more cautious. Those with less become more dependent on alternative strategies, gathering, exchange, or, in some cases, seeking help. The village remains connected, but the balance is shifting. Quiet exchanges. You begin to observe small exchanges between households. A measure of grain for assistance in the fields, a portion of stored food in return for gathered plants, labor traded for access to slightly better land. These exchanges are not formalized. They rely on trust, on reputation, on the expectation of reciprocity. But they are also limited. No one has enough to give freely for long. So each exchange is weighed carefully. The possibility of leaving. As conditions persist, the idea of leaving begins to surface. You hear it in fragments of conversation. There is said to be better rain further south. A relative in another village might take us in. But as in Anatolia, migration is not simple. The journey itself requires resources, food, energy, knowledge of the route, and there is no guarantee that conditions elsewhere are better. Some consider it. Few act on it, at least for now. Staying, even under strain, offers a known environment. Leaving introduces uncertainty of a different kind. The land changes shape. Over time, the physical landscape begins to show more visible signs of stress. Small gullies form where wind and occasional brief rains have carried soil away. Edges of fields become less defined. Paths shift slightly as the ground changes beneath repeated use. You begin to see how drought is not just an absence of water. It is a process that reshapes the land itself. And once changed, the land does not easily return to its previous state. A community in suspension. The village exists now in a kind of suspension. There is no clear turning point, no moment when conditions suddenly worsen or improve. Instead, there is a steady continuation of strain, managed through constant adjustment. Life continues, but at a reduced pace. Work continues, but with reduced expectation. Hope remains, but it is quieter. An unresolved question. You stand at the edge of a field where the soil has thinned enough that the underlying layer begins to show through. The wind moves across it, lifting small traces of dust. You think about all the strategies you have observed: barriers against wind, careful planting, foraging, rationing, cooperation. Each one has extended survival, but none has restored what is being lost. And as the dry conditions persist, a deeper question begins to take shape, one that reaches beyond a single season. What happens when survival depends not just on enduring drought, but on preserving the land itself, even as it slowly slips away? You remain in the village as the long dry period reaches a point where change of some kind becomes inevitable. It does not arrive suddenly. There is no single storm, no dramatic shift that restores the land in a moment. Instead, the change begins subtly, almost imperceptibly, in the same way the drought itself began. One morning, the air feels different. Not wet, not yet, but heavier. The wind, which has been a constant presence, slows slightly. The sky, once an uninterrupted pale expanse, shows faint variation, thin layers of cloud that linger longer than before. It is not rain, but it is not nothing. The first rain that matters. When the rain finally comes, it is brief. You might almost miss it if you were not paying attention. A light, steady fall that darkens the soil for a short time before stopping. There is no immediate reaction from the villagers, no visible celebration. Instead, they watch. Because one rain does not end a drought. But it does change something. You walk into the fields and see how the soil responds. In areas where the land has been protected, where windbreaks were built, where the surface was carefully managed, the water seeps in, darkening the earth more deeply. In other areas where the soil has thinned or hardened, the rain runs off quickly, leaving little behind. The difference is quiet but significant. The efforts made during the drought, small, persistent acts of preservation, now begin to show their value. Planting after uncertainty. The farmers do not rush to plant. They wait. Another rain follows, then another, still irregular, still uncertain, but enough to suggest a shift in the pattern. Only then do they begin to use what remains of their seed. You notice how restrained they are. Fields are not fully planted. Seeds are placed carefully, often in the same microareas that were preserved during the drought depressions, sheltered plots, places where moisture is more likely to remain. Millet is still the dominant crop. It is trusted. Even as conditions improve slightly, the farmers do not immediately return to more demanding grains. The memory of failure remains too close. The land responds unevenly. As the crops begin to grow, the unevenness of the land becomes clear. In some areas, green returns steadily. The plants are not as dense or vigorous as in a good year, but they are stable. In other areas, growth is sparse or inconsistent. The soil, having lost structure and depth, cannot support uniform recovery. You see how the drought has left its mark. Not as a single, visible scar, but as a pattern of variation, some places recovering more quickly, others lagging behind. The land is still productive, but it is no longer predictable. Rebuilding the soil. You begin to notice new efforts focused not just on crops, but on the soil itself. Farmers spread whatever organic material they can gather, crop residues, plant matter, even household waste across certain fields. This is not done in large quantities, but in targeted areas where recovery seems possible. The goal is simple: to rebuild what has been lost. You also see continued use of windbreaks, even though the winds have lessened. The barriers remain, maintained and adjusted, as if the villagers understand that the conditions which created the drought could return. In some places, Fields are deliberately left fallow not because they are unproductive, but because they need time to recover. This is a shift in thinking. The land is no longer treated as something that will always provide. It is something that must be managed carefully over time. Food returns slowly. Inside the village, the effects of the changing conditions are felt gradually. Meals become slightly more substantial, porridge thickens, bread portions increase if only by a small amount. But the habits formed during the drought do not disappear. Food is still measured. Storage remains careful. Even as new grain begins to arrive, it is not consumed freely. It is added to reserves, extending the sense of security rather than replacing it. You notice how people eat with the same awareness as before, perhaps a little less tense, but still deliberate. Recovery, like the rain, is incremental. Those who stayed, the families who remained in the village, now see the results of their decision. For some, the outcome is positive. Their preserved fields, their careful management, have allowed them to recover more quickly. For others, the recovery is slower. Fields that were heavily eroded or abandoned during the drought take longer to become productive again. Some may never fully return to their previous state. You see how staying was not a guarantee of success, but it provided a foundation knowledge of the land, familiarity with its subtle variations that makes adaptation possible. Those who left, not all who left return. You hear occasional news of those who migrated. Some found work in other regions. Some settled elsewhere. Some faced difficulties that are only hinted at in quiet conversations. A few do come back. They return with different experiences, sometimes with small amounts of grain or tools, sometimes simply with stories. These stories add to the village's understanding not just of drought, but of the broader world beyond their fields. And yet the village remains smaller than before. The drought has reshaped not only the land, but the population. A changed relationship with the land. As time passes, you begin to see that the most lasting impact of the drought is not physical, but behavioral. The farmers no longer treat good conditions as permanent. Even in seasons where rain is sufficient, they maintain many of the practices developed during hardship. Fields are not planted to full capacity. Windbreaks are maintained. Water is conserved wherever possible. Grain is stored with greater discipline. This is not fear. It is memory translated into action. The return of wind. Eventually, the wind returns. Not as a destructive force, but as a reminder. It moves across the fields, lifting small traces of dust. But this time, the soil holds more firmly. The barriers slow its movement. The land, though altered, is more resilient than before. You realize that the drought has not made the environment less harsh. It has made the response to it more deliberate. What remains after loss? As you walk through the village one last time, you notice both what has returned and what has not. There is food again, though not in abundance. There is activity in the fields, though not at full intensity. There is continuity, but also change. Some fields remain unused. Some homes stand empty. Some knowledge, perhaps, has been lost with those who did not stay. And yet much remains. Enough to continue. A quiet reflection. You step back from the less landscape, watching as the light settles over the fields and the wind moves gently across the surface. What you have seen here is not a story of overcoming drought in a single moment. It is a story of managing decline, preserving what can be saved, and rebuilding slowly when conditions allow. There was no single solution. No technology that reversed the process. Only a series of small, careful actions, each one shaped by experience, each one limited, but together forming a system of survival. And as you turn away, one thought lingers, quiet but persistent. If the land can be lost grain by grain and rebuilt just as slowly, how much of survival depends not on sudden change, but on the patience to protect what little remains, even when it seems almost gone? Story 4. The Deccan Plateau's Silent Adaptations. You find yourself standing on the vast expanse of the Deccan Plateau in southern India during the late medieval period under the influence of the Vijayanagara Empire. The land stretches outward in muted tones of red and brown, broken by rocky outcrops and scattered clusters of hardy vegetation. At first glance, it does not appear lifeless, but it does feel uncertain. Unlike the regions you have seen before, this landscape is governed not by a single, predictable water source, but by two seasonal systems, the southwest monsoon and the northeast monsoon. Together, they define the rhythm of life here. And yet, they are not reliable. Some years one arrives weekly, sometimes both falter, occasionally they fail in sequence. And when that happens, the land does not simply dry. It pauses. A climate of intervals. You begin to understand that life here is built around intervals, periods of rain, followed by long stretches of dryness. The soil reflects this pattern. It is not loose and powdery like the less of northern China, nor enriched annually like the floodplains of the Nile. Instead, it is dense, often hard, capable of holding moisture when it receives it but reluctant to absorb water quickly when it is dry. You press your foot into the ground and feel resistance. This soil demands timing. If rain comes too quickly after a long dry spell, much of it runs off before it can soak in. If it comes too late, crops may not have enough time to mature. Everything depends not just on rainfall, but on when it arrives. The first failed monsoon. You arrive at a moment when the southwest monsoon, the more significant of the two, has already passed. Or rather, it has failed. Not entirely, but enough to matter. You hear it described in simple terms. The rains came late. They did not stay. The ground did not drink enough. These phrases carry a quiet weight. There is no dramatic language, no declaration of disaster, but you begin to recognize the pattern. The fields have been prepared. Seeds were planted when the first rains arrived, but the moisture did not last. Now the young plants struggle. Some have already withered. Others remain but weak, their growth uneven. The season has not ended, but its outcome is already uncertain. Farming without certainty. The farmers here do not rely on a single crop. Instead, you see a mixture: millets, pulses, and oilseeds, each chosen for different tolerances and growth cycles. Millets once again form the backbone. They are resilient, capable of surviving with limited water. Pulses enrich the soil slightly, even as they provide food. Oilseeds offer another layer of possibility, though they are more sensitive to conditions. This diversity is intentional. It does not guarantee success, but it reduces the chance of total failure. You notice how fields are often intercropped, different plants growing side by side. This is not random. It spreads risk across the land. If one crop fails, another might survive. It is a form of balance built into the soil itself. Capturing rain without canals. There are no large irrigation systems here, no vast networks of canals. But there are smaller, quieter methods. You are led to a shallow depression at the edge of a field. It looks natural, but closer inspection reveals subtle shaping edges reinforced with packed earth, the base slightly deepened. This is a rain catchment. When the monsoon arrives, water flows across the land and collects here. From this point, it slowly seeps into the surrounding soil, extending the period during which crops can access moisture. You see many such structures, each modest in size but collectively significant. In addition, there are small earthen bunds, raised barriers built along the contours of the land. These slow the movement of water, allowing it to infiltrate rather than run off. These techniques do not store water for long periods. They extend its presence. The role of timing. Timing governs everything. You observe how farmers wait for the first rains before planting. Plant too early, and seeds may fail if the rains are delayed. Plant too late, and the growing season may be too short. This year, the timing was wrong. The rains came late, and when they did, they were brief. Now, the farmers face a difficult decision. Should they attempt a second planting, using what seeds remain, hopping for the northeast monsoon? Or should they conserve their resources, accepting a reduced harvest in exchange for future security? There is no clear answer. Different families choose differently. Food and anticipation. Inside the village, food practices begin to shift. At first, the changes are subtle. Portions become slightly smaller, meals slightly simpler. There is more reliance on stored grains from previous seasons. You notice how these stores are managed carefully. Clay containers are sealed, sometimes buried partially in the ground to keep them cool. Grain is checked regularly, protected from pests and moisture. But there is also anticipation. The northeast monsoon has not yet arrived. There is still a possibility. And so, the villagers do not act as though the year is lost. They wait. Livestock as moving resources. Animals play a different role here than in some other regions. You see goats and cattle moving across the landscape, guided to areas where sparse vegetation still grows. These animals are not just sources of food or labor. They are mobile resources. When one area becomes too dry, they can be moved to another. This flexibility provides a form of resilience that fixed crops cannot. But it also requires careful management. Too many animals in one area can strip it of vegetation entirely, accelerating the effects of drought. So movement is controlled, deliberate. The social fabric holds for now. The village operates with a balance of cooperation and independence. Families manage their own fields and stores, but there is shared knowledge, shared labor in certain tasks, and a general awareness of collective well-being. You notice how information flows. News of rainfall in nearby regions, of crop conditions, of decisions made by other villages, these details are exchanged regularly. This information shapes behavior. If rains are reported elsewhere, it may influence decisions about planting or movement. If conditions are poor across the region, it reinforces caution. The village is not isolated. It is part of a wider network of observation and adaptation. Waiting for the second chance. As time passes, attention shifts toward the northeast monsoon. This is the second chance. It is typically weaker than the southwest monsoon, but in years like this, it becomes critical. You notice how the air is watched. The direction of the wind, the formation of clouds, the subtle changes in humidity, these are read carefully, almost instinctively. There is no guarantee that the rains will come, but there is enough possibility to sustain hope. The fields hold their breath. You walk through the fields again. The surviving plants remain, though many are stunted. The soil is dry, but not completely lifeless. There is a sense of pause, as if the land itself is waiting. Seeds remain in storage, or in some cases in the ground, dormant. Everything depends on what happens next. An unanswered question. You stand at the edge of a field, looking out over the plateau as the sky begins to shift slightly, clouds gathering faintly in the distance. The farmers have adjusted as they can, diversifying crops, conserving water, managing soil, balancing risk. They have not given up, but their strategies depend on something beyond their control. And as the second monsoon approaches, a quiet question settles over the land. What happens when survival depends not on one chance for rain, but on a second chance that may or may not come at all. You remain on the Deccan Plateau as the northeast monsoon approaches a season that, in normal years, provides only supplemental rainfall. But this year, after the weak southwest monsoon, its arrival carries a weight far beyond its usual measure. The land, already strained, waits quietly, and the farmers, having endured weeks of uncertainty, prepare for what may be their last chance to save the season. The first drops in their promise. The first raindrops are small, almost hesitant. You watch as the soil darkens slightly beneath them. It smells faintly of damp earth, a scent that brings subtle relief to those watching. But you know from experience, and the villagers know instinctively, that one light shower will not be enough to restore the crops. The soil has been dry too long, the roots of young plants weakened, and evaporation still quick under the high plateau sun. Yet the arrival of rain changes behavior immediately. Fields are inspected more frequently. Bunds are reinforced. Small trenches are dug to capture and direct water towards surviving plants. Even animals are guided carefully, kept from trampling areas where moisture has begun to accumulate. Every drop is precious, and every action is calculated to stretch its effect. Patchwork recovery. Walking through the fields, you see uneven patterns of survival. Millet sprouts that were stunted under the early drought now show slight green growth where soil and moisture intersected favorably. Pulses that seemed doomed begin to root more firmly, responding to even minor hydration. But these pockets are isolated. Other areas remain dry, the soil cracked and pale. This unevenness shapes labor decisions. Families direct their efforts toward areas with better potential, abandoning marginal patches to conserve energy. The plateau's irregular topography, rocky ridges, depressions, and shallow soil pockets determines where recovery is possible. Nature itself becomes the guide, and human intervention adapts around it. Water management intensifies. The modest catchments and contour bunds built earlier now play their critical role. Water that would otherwise have run off the hard soil is trapped and redirected. Small clay reservoirs, dug carefully over previous seasons, hold remnants of the first rains and slowly feed the soil. Villagers monitor these systems with vigilance, repairing minor cracks and clearing debris to prevent loss. Even the act of planting is reconsidered. Seeds are placed in areas where water persists longest, and spacing is adjusted to reduce competition. Farmers are acutely aware that too much concentration could result in wasted effort if a subsequent dry spell returns. Each decision is a gamble, weighed carefully against what the land has already revealed about its limits. Labor, cooperation, and timing. The northeast monsoon, unlike its stronger counterpart, is unpredictable and often brief. In response, the village organizes labor flexibly. Tasks are prioritized, with multiple families sometimes pooling efforts to manage the fields most likely to yield. Knowledge is shared. Reports from neighboring villages on rainfall patterns influence local choices. Even within households, labor is staggered. Adults and older children alternate between field work, water management, and foraging for supplementary food. Every movement is measured. Exhaustion is dangerous because stamina must be preserved not just for work, but for responding to any sudden change in weather. Alternative food sources. With the possibility of full crop recovery uncertain, villagers increasingly rely on secondary food sources. Goats and other livestock are carefully grazed on sparse vegetation, but they also provide milk, which supplements the diet. Wild roots, tubers, and hardy plants are collected, often in areas just beyond the village, forming a quiet, sustainable foraging system. Even small amounts matter significantly for survival. Food practices remain cautious. Stored grains from previous seasons are rationed more strictly. Meals are simple and deliberate, with quantities calculated to extend available reserves until the end of the season. Cooking methods are adapted to reduce waste and maximize nutritional content. The community's patience becomes as important a resource as water or grain. The impact of memory. You notice how past hardships shape current behavior. The weak southwest monsoon left a memory of scarcity embedded in every household. Even with the northeast rains now arriving, farmers do not abandon the strategies they developed during the prior dry weeks. Millet is prioritized over less resilient crops. Soil conservation measures remain in place. Water is never allowed to flow freely without thought. This memory acts as both caution and guidance. It slows recovery in a sense, because the villagers do not rush into planting fully, but it also prevents repeated errors. Their knowledge is hard-won, a collection of adjustments that reflect the plateau's harsh realities. The community watches the sky. The northeast monsoon's arrival transforms the village's attention. The sky is observed constantly. Subtle shifts in clouds, wind, and humidity are shared among neighbors. Even minor signs, an unusual gust, a fleeting shadow of rain are reported and interpreted. The villagers' collective awareness becomes a living network, linking individual observations into a larger understanding of the season's potential. Yet uncertainty remains. The monsoon could end abruptly. A sudden dry spell might follow, undoing all recent gains. You sense a tension between hope and preparation, a tension that drives constant vigilance without overt anxiety. The plateau's lessons in adaptation. Over the weeks, it becomes clear that survival is not simply a matter of rain or soil. It is a complex interplay of careful observation, incremental action, and collective knowledge. The plateau does not forgive mistakes easily, but it allows subtle, intelligent adjustments to persist. Fields, animals, and water management systems all reflect these adaptations. Labor is deliberate and prioritized. Food is rationed. Knowledge of the land, the weather, and one another becomes as essential as seeds or water. An unresolved question. By the time the northeast monsoon begins to weaken, the village has achieved a partial recovery. Some crops survive, some fail. Water resources are maximized, food is rationed, and the soil has been preserved where possible. Yet the season is not complete, and the future remains uncertain. As you stand on the plateau watching the land and the sky, you are left with a question that has shaped every moment you have witnessed. When survival depends on multiple, unreliable rains and the slow work of human patience, how much of a season's outcome is determined by chance, and how much by the quiet accumulation of small, deliberate choices? You remain on the Deccan Plateau as the northeast monsoon begins to taper off. The season has stretched long, uncertain, defined not by dramatic events, but by the quiet, persistent rhythms of waiting, adjusting, and observing. The villagers now face the moment when months of careful management, strategic planting, and resource conservation will reveal the outcome of their decisions. A patchwork of growth. Walking through the fields, you notice the uneven results. In pockets where soil was preserved and water captured effectively, millet and pulses have matured, their stalks resilient though not abundant. These areas are the result of labor, patience, and careful observation, a subtle testimony to human ingenuity against natural constraints. Elsewhere, crops are sparse, stunted, or completely absent. The northeast rains were too brief, too weak, or arrived too late to reverse earlier losses. Fields that were abandoned earlier remain barren, reinforcing the lesson that timing combined with effort is critical on this plateau. The labor of reaping. Harvesting begins cautiously. Farmers focus first on the sections of land with the highest probability of yield. Each stalk is evaluated, and only the mature plants are cut, leaving weaker specimens to be reaped later if they continue to grow. Labor is deliberate, methodical, measured against the limited energy available after months of conservation. Children help with light tasks gathering fallen grains, carrying small bundles while adults focus on cutting and thrashing. The work proceeds slowly, ensuring minimal loss. Even the act of thrashing is done with care. Grains are separated efficiently but not hurriedly to prevent breakage and waste. Food reserves and distribution. As grain is harvested, storage becomes central once again. The community continues to rely on small, dispersed containers, clay pots partially buried, small granaries reinforced with mud, and carefully managed household stores. Each measure is designed to protect the harvest from pests, moisture, and spoilage. Families redistribute food among themselves, sometimes exchanging surplus from slightly more productive plots for labor or assistance during harvest. These exchanges are quiet, negotiated with subtle attention to fairness and need. Social cohesion is maintained not through abundance, but through careful management and trust. Evaluating the season. The villagers pause to assess the results. It is not a bountiful year, nor a catastrophic one. The plateau has yielded some sustenance, sufficient to carry households into the next planting season, but not enough to create surplus or security beyond the immediate future. This season, like so many before it, is defined by adaptation rather than abundance. It is a survival story told in small increments, measured, deliberate, resilient. Success is not dramatic. It is steady, quiet, real. Reflection on knowledge and experience. You observe how memory and experience influence behavior even now. Families continue to conserve water, even when small amounts are available. Prioritize resilient crops such as millet. Maintain soil conservation structures. Ration food deliberately. The dry season has left an indelible mark. Knowledge of risk, learned through observation and hard-earned experience, shapes every action. The villagers' survival depends less on a single monsoon and more on the cumulative wisdom of prior hardships. Animals as partners in survival. Goats, cattle, and other livestock have contributed significantly to survival. By moving animals strategically across pastures, villagers preserved vegetation while providing milk and occasionally meat. Livestock management remains a delicate balance between immediate need and long-term sustainability, a principle reinforced by months of uncertainty. Even animals show the effect of careful planning. Grazing paths, water access, and rest periods are coordinated with human labor, ensuring that resources are maximized without depleting them completely. The plateau and patience. The Deccan Plateau has taught a quiet lesson about survival. The land itself is not forgiving, but it does allow for careful, deliberate adaptation. Water can be captured, soil preserved, labor prioritized, and food rationed, but only if humans act with attention to detail and patience. This is not dramatic heroism. It is the steady work of people who understand that survival is a long-term negotiation with the land, with climate, and with one another. A lingering question. As you stand at the edge of a field, watching the plateau stretch toward distant ridges and rocky outcrops, you notice the subtle interplay of land, water, and human effort. You realize that survival here depends not on grand gestures, but on countless small, deliberate actions. And yet, even with all these adaptations, there is a question that persists. When a season's outcome is determined by fragile rains, shifting winds, and patient labor, how much of survival is owed to the land itself, and how much to the resilience and foresight of those who live upon it? Story 5. Famine in the Scottish Highlands, the potato and the peat fires. You find yourself on the windswept slopes of the Scottish Highlands during the early 19th century. The land is rugged, steep, and punctuated by rocky outcrops, with scattered crofts, the small tenant farms that cling stubbornly to the thin soil. Heather and bracken dominate the landscape, and in the distance, peat smoke rises in delicate wisps from low, stone-built cottages. Here, survival is a daily negotiation with cold, wet weather, poor soils, and the occasional bounty or failure of the potato crop. The villagers do not farm for comfort. They farm to endure. The importance of the potato. you quickly learn that the potato is more than food. It is sustenance, insurance, and a lifeline all in one. In these highlands, grain grows poorly, if at all, on the shallow, rocky soils. But the potato tolerates what little the land provides, and it can feed a family for months with a relatively small plot. Families plant early, tending small patches carefully. Each tuber represents calculated hope. The soil is dug deeply, and manure, usually animal dung or seaweed, is added when possible. Planting, watering, and weeding are carried out with deliberate care. Yet even these efforts do not guarantee success. The potato is vulnerable to blight, frost, and flood. A single failed harvest can reduce a family to near starvation. Peat, the hidden resource. Water is rarely the limiting factor here. The rains fall steadily, soaking the soil, but warmth is scarce, and warmth is essential. You are guided to the peat banks that surround the village. These low, cut-out pits, sometimes dug from boggy ground, provide fuel. Peat is labor-intensive to extract, cut into slabs and dried carefully over weeks. Once ignited, it burns slowly, providing the low, consistent heat needed for cooking and warmth in the cold, damp cottages. Without peat, even the potato becomes a tenuous resource. Raw tubers are edible, but to sustain a family through winter, they must be cooked, and cooking requires fuel. Seasonal struggles. The highland year is measured in seasons, but each season brings a distinct set of challenges. Spring, planting and maintaining young potatoes, repairing crofts damaged over winter, preparing peat for fuel. Summer, tending crops and supplementing diets with foraged plants, wild berries, and any surplus livestock. Autumn, harvesting potatoes, securing peat for winter, storing what food can be preserved. Winter, conserving heat and food, maintaining crofts against storms, and surviving with limited mobility. The calendar itself is a survival strategy. Even within these cycles, failure is possible. Too much rain in spring can rot the potato sets. A harsh frost can kill emerging shoots. Peat that has not dried fully produces smoke but little heat. The croft as a unit of survival. You visit one family's croft, a modest structure of stone and thatch, divided into a single living space with a loft for storage. The croft is designed to maximize limited resources. A central hearth provides heat and cooking. Small windows retain warmth and light. Storage areas keep grain, potatoes, and dried fish or meat safe from moisture and pests. Every object, every arrangement is practical. Decoration is minimal. Comfort is secondary to survival. You notice that crofts are often clustered in small settlements, allowing limited social support but maintaining independence. Villagers may help one another during planting or harvest, but they also guard what little they possess. Work and energy. Daily life is physically demanding. You follow a farmer through planting, digging, manuring, and arranging potatoes in precise spacing. The work is slow and measured. Fatigue is constant, yet the effort cannot be spared. A mistake or delay can mean the difference between sufficient food and scarcity. Children contribute as soon as they are able. They gather peat, tend small gardens, or care for livestock. Women manage cooking, childcare, and household stores, adjusting meals carefully to stretch provisions. Labor is constant, unrelenting, yet adapted to the rhythms of the land and climate. The weight of storage. Potatoes, once harvested, must be preserved carefully. They are stored in dark, cool areas, often packed in layers of straw to prevent rot. Moisture must be controlled. Too wet, and the crop decays. Too dry, and the tubers shrivel. You notice the quiet attention paid to storage. Families check the potatoes regularly, removing any that show signs of spoilage. Even a single rotting tuber can threaten nearby stores. Food security depends on diligence as much as harvest size. Community observations. Despite the rugged individualism of crofting life, Information flows quietly through the community. News of crop conditions in neighboring glens, reports of livestock disease, or the status of local markets influences decisions. Knowledge is a subtle but critical resource. When bad news spreads like reports of blight affecting neighboring areas, the villagers adjust planting and rationing strategies immediately. They do not panic, but they respond with careful recalibration. The first signs of scarcity. Even in a year without disaster, you can sense the precarious balance. Food is sufficient, but barely. Winter approaches, and you notice small adjustments. Meals are more consistent, with fewer indulgences. Heat is rationed carefully, with fireplaces maintained at lower, steadier levels. Children may eat less than adults, prioritizing energy for those doing heavy labor. The community survives not by abundance, but by disciplined conservation and foresight. A lingering thought. As you watch peat smoke curl above the rooftops against the backdrop of the fading autumn sun, one question quietly lingers. In a land where a single failed potato crop can tip the balance from sustenance to famine, how much of survival is owed to careful preparation, and how much to sheer luck against cold, wet, and disease? You remain in the Scottish Highlands as the first hints of disaster appear. The crofters have completed their autumn harvest, stacking their potato stores in carefully insulated pits and lofts, and the peat has been cut, dried, and arranged for winter. At first, the preparation suggests stability, but beneath the surface, a quiet tension lingers, an uncertainty born of history, climate, and the delicate dependency on a single crop. The arrival of blight. Late in the autumn, black marks appear on the leaves of some potato plants. They begin to wilt prematurely, and a faint, musty odor accompanies the discoloration. This is Phytophthora infestans, a microscopic organism that can destroy a harvest within days under the right conditions. The villagers do not immediately understand the full scale of the threat. They observe symptoms carefully: which fields are affected, how quickly the leaves collapse, whether tubers are showing early rot. Some families consider digging potatoes early to salvage what they can. Others hope the blight will slow in colder temperatures. Blight spreads unpredictably. Moisture, temperature, wind, and chance all combine to determine which patches survive. Even the most carefully tended potatoes are vulnerable. The threat is invisible, yet devastatingly real. Adjustments and salvage. Crofters respond with what measures they can take. Plants showing the earliest signs of disease are harvested immediately. Tubers are inspected rigorously, with any sign of rot prompting immediate removal from storage. Families ration remaining supplies more strictly. Porridge is thinned further. Potatoes are stretched with small amounts of grains or preserved vegetables. Meals are carefully divided to ensure that every member of the household has some sustenance. Even children's portions are measured, balancing growth needs against survival. These adjustments are small but critical. Each decision can prevent complete loss of energy and productivity. The Highlands, you notice, is a land where minor miscalculations can cascade into catastrophe. Peat fires and winter heat. As winter advances, temperatures drop and dampness permeates the crofts. Peat fires burn steadily, providing warmth and the means to cook even the smallest portions of food. But fuel is limited. The villagers ration peat carefully, choosing when and how long to burn fires. Peat management is a subtle art. Slabs are stacked with attention to airflow, ensuring slow combustion and maximum heat retention. Excess smoke is avoided, both to conserve fuel and to prevent respiratory discomfort. A household that mismanages its peat supply risks more than cold. It risks failure to cook food, which could be fatal. Supplementing the diet. With potato stores under threat, villagers turn increasingly to supplementary foods. Livestock, primarily goats, provide occasional milk or meat, but their numbers are limited by grazing capacity. Foraged foods, wild berries, roots, and seaweed along coastal glens become crucial additions. Even small amounts of these foods provide variety and vital nutrients. Families also exchange food within the community. A household that lost part of its crop may receive small contributions from neighbors who have fared slightly better. These exchanges are discreet and measured, designed to sustain survival without creating dependency or conflict. The strain on labor and energy. Winter labor becomes a delicate balance. Crofters must maintain peat fires, check stored potatoes, tend animals, and repair homes while conserving personal energy. Each task is measured. Adults rotate responsibilities to avoid exhaustion. Children are given lighter work. Fatigue is as dangerous as hunger because it limits the household's ability to respond to emergencies. The community operates like a quiet machine, each member aware of their role. Small failures, spilled potatoes, a burned peat slab, or a neglected animal can cascade into larger problems. The vigilance required to survive is constant. The social dynamics of scarcity. Scarcity affects social behavior subtly. While outright conflict is rare, households are cautious in exchanges. Reciprocity is expected, but trust is tempered by awareness of limited resources. People observe one another, noting who is struggling and who can help. The community's cohesion depends on careful negotiation and mutual understanding. At the same time, knowledge is shared. Villagers discuss crop failures, signs of disease, and techniques for preserving potatoes. Even small innovations, lining storage pits with straw, rotating peat slabs, more efficiently spread quickly. Survival depends as much on collective wisdom as individual effort. The mental weight of uncertainty. You notice that the stress of potential famine is visible in subtle ways. Deliberate packing during work, quiet discussion around meals, and careful monitoring of storage. Families live in constant awareness of fragility. A small loss, a rotting potato, a misplaced peat slab, or a failed animal can feel disproportionately significant because it affects the household's immediate survival. Yet the villagers do not despair openly. They accept that hardship is part of life in the highlands. Adaptation and patience are as much a part of their culture as language or ritual. Each day is an exercise in careful judgment, balancing hope, caution, and practicality. The role of observation. Observation becomes a central skill. People track weather patterns, noting subtle changes in wind, temperature, and humidity. Crops are inspected daily, with early signs of blight or stress triggering immediate action. Even animals are watched for illness or unusual behavior. This knowledge accumulates slowly, season by season, creating an informal system of survival intelligence. It is not written down, but passed orally and through practice. Each family draws on the lessons of previous years, combining them with real-time observation to guide decisions. An unanswered question. By midwinter, the crofts have stabilized enough to survive the cold months, but the potato blight has taken its toll. Some households have lost significant stores, others retain enough to avoid starvation. The future remains uncertain. Spring may bring recovery or renewed hardship. As you watch peat smoke drift from rooftops and the villagers move quietly through frost-covered fields, one question lingers. When survival depends on a single, vulnerable crop and the constant management of scarce resources, how much is controlled by human diligence and how much by the unpredictable whims of weather, disease, and luck? You remain in the Scottish Highlands as winter deepens, blanketing the hills in frost and snow. Inside the small crofts, families huddle near peat fires, the faint amber glow illuminating the careful arrangements of stored potatoes, grains, and small quantities of preserved meat. Outside, the wind rattles the stone walls and whistles over the ridges, reminding everyone of the harshness of the landscape. Survival here is not a heroic tale of triumph, it is the slow, persistent management of scarcity. The outcome of blight. By late winter, the impact of the potato blight becomes clear. Many households have lost a portion of their stores, particularly the early planted tubers vulnerable to decay. Others, fortunate with timing, soil depth, and careful storage, have retained enough for the coming months. The results are uneven, as they often are in the highlands. Survival was never guaranteed. It was carefully negotiated day by day. This uneven outcome shapes relationships in the village. Families with slightly more food share discreetly with neighbors who have less. Knowledge gained from this season, such as the effectiveness of straw-lined storage pits or rotating peat slabs, spreads quickly, ensuring better preparation in future years. Each small lesson becomes part of a collective memory, a quiet accumulation of strategies to buffer against recurring scarcity. The role of peat in survival. Peat fires remain central to winter survival. Families use them sparingly, allowing slow, steady combustion that stretches limited fuel supplies. Cooking is carefully timed to coincide with the warmest hours of the day, and water is heated only when necessary. The smoke is a reminder of scarcity, but it is also a signal of ingenuity, the ability to stretch limited resources over weeks and months. Without peat, survival would have been far more precarious. Potatoes require cooking to maximize calories, and warmth is essential for maintaining energy and health. Even a small mismanagement of fuel could cascade into food shortages, illness, and exhaustion. The crofters' meticulous care with this resource demonstrates how energy, food, and labor are intertwined in survival strategies. Adaptation and knowledge. Through the winter, you notice the villagers' intimate understanding of the land and their crops. Observation is continuous. Potatoes are checked for signs of spoilage, peat moisture levels monitored, livestock health scrutinized. These observations are communicated quietly, often during shared work or communal gatherings. Advice is offered carefully, balancing caution with practical action. Every small adjustment, removing a rotting tuber, layering additional straw, moving an animal to better grazing, represents accumulated knowledge. The highlands demand this attentiveness. The land is unforgiving, but it also rewards careful observation, disciplined work, and incremental improvements. The social fabric. Even in scarcity, the highland community functions with a delicate balance of independence and interdependence. Families manage their own crofts, but subtle systems of mutual assistance persist. A neighbor may lend a shovel, help with peat stacking, or share a few tubers, trusting that reciprocity will follow. These exchanges are measured. Resources are too limited for generosity to be unchecked, yet they sustain the community's cohesion and enhance collective resilience. The social structure here is pragmatic. Cooperation is tempered by awareness of scarcity, and each household is acutely conscious of its responsibilities and limitations. Survival is both individual and collective, balanced between autonomy and interdependence. Lessons from a harsh winter. The winter passes slowly. Frost thaws intermittently, snow melts, and peat fires continue their steady glow in the cottages. By early spring, the surviving potato stores are minimal but sufficient. Families have endured, not through abundance, but through careful management, disciplined labor, and patient observation. You realize that this survival is built on multiple, overlapping strategies. Careful selection, planting and tending of crops. Strategic use of peat for warmth and cooking. Strict rationing of food and labor. Continuous observation and adjustment based on real-time conditions. Selective cooperation and resource sharing within the community. This is not dramatic heroism. It is resilience expressed quietly, consistently, and practically a testament to the ordinary human capacity to endure under relentless pressure. A reflection on fragility. Standing outside, you see smoke rising from the cottages, the faint light of the early morning sun glinting off frost-covered fields. The land has provided just enough, but only because the crofters adapted to its limitations, controlled their labor and energy, and responded constantly to small, incremental challenges. The lesson is subtle yet profound. In places where a single crop carries the weight of survival, the work of living is measured in vigilance, observation, and patience. A season's outcome is never guaranteed, and yet careful, deliberate action can prevent catastrophe. An open-ended question. As you leave the crofts, watching the peat fires flicker and the frost begin to melt, one thought lingers. In a world where small failures can cascade into disaster, and where survival depends on careful attention to each small resource, what does it mean to truly endure, and how much of human resilience is built on preparation versus sheer luck? Story 6. The arid villages of Anatolia, stone walls and rainwater pools. You find yourself on the rugged hills of central Anatolia during the late medieval period. The landscape stretches in muted tones of ochre and gray, interrupted by low stone walls and scattered villages clinging to the hillsides. Rain is rare, and when it comes, it is unpredictable. Streams are shallow and seasonal, and water becomes the defining factor in every decision the villagers make. In these settlements, the very act of living revolves around managing scarcity. Every stone, every dugout pool, every terrace on the hillside serves a purpose in conserving water, preventing erosion, and protecting the soil that sustains crops. The villagers do not merely cultivate land, they engineer survival into the landscape itself. The architecture of conservation. Walking through the village, you notice the dry stone walls that line fields and pathways. They are not decorative. They are functional, built to slow the movement of soil and to channel rainwater into terraces where crops are planted. Some walls are low, allowing water to trickle over slowly. Others are reinforced with larger stones, forming barriers that prevent soil from washing away during rare but intense storms. The terraces themselves are modest. Flat strips of land carved into the hillsides, often no more than a few meters wide, allow for cultivation where slope would otherwise prevent it. Soil is carefully maintained, occasionally enriched with composted plant matter or animal dung. Every inch matters. Mismanagement can result in erosion that may take years to repair. Water pools and rain capture. You are shown shallow pools dug to capture rainfall. They are often lined with clay or stones to prevent seepage. When rain does arrive, water flows into these basins from channels carved along the hillsides. The pools do not provide large quantities, but they extend the period during which crops and livestock have access to water. You notice how these pools serve multiple purposes. They allow villagers to water livestock gradually, conserving stored water. They irrigate nearby terraces using simple channels. They provide emergency reserves when the dry season is particularly harsh. These pools are modest but vital. Without them, the villages could not survive the extended dry periods. Crops that endure. Fields are planted with hardy grains and pulses wheat, barley, chickpeas that tolerate drought better than more delicate crops. Planting schedules are dictated not only by the season, but by microclimates within the hillsides. Depressions where water lingers slightly longer are prioritized, and rockier, exposed plots are often reserved for livestock grazing rather than cultivation. The villagers understand the limits of the soil. Overworking a terrace risks erosion and loss of fertility. Underworking it risks insufficient yield. Every planting decision is an act of balancing potential against risk. Livestock as a resource. Sheep and goats are central to survival. Grazing is carefully managed, rotated between hillsides to prevent overuse and to preserve fragile vegetation. Animals provide milk, meat, and dung, the latter returned to fields as fertilizer. Water and forage are limited, so herding is strategic. You notice that animals are often moved considerable distances during the hottest parts of summer, guided to areas where water has collected or where shade reduces water loss. The villagers' attention to livestock is as much about conservation as it is about food. Daily life under scarcity. Life is structured around the availability of water and the demands of the landscape. You follow villagers as they carry out daily tasks. Watering terraces and filling pools. Harvesting mature grains while ensuring soil and terraces are not damaged. Collecting dung and compost for soil enrichment. Maintaining walls and channels to prevent erosion. Children assist with lighter tasks, learning the subtle skills required for long-term survival. Every action is intertwined with the careful management of resources. Nothing is trivial, because missteps carry consequences that may only become apparent months or years later. Food storage and planning. Once harvested, grains and pulses are stored in clay containers or small granaries, often elevated or ventilated to prevent spoilage. The villagers ration carefully, knowing that the next rain may not arrive as expected. Meals are simple, grains cooked in water, sometimes supplemented with small amounts of legumes or vegetables. Nothing is wasted. Even chaff or inedible plant parts may be composted or used for animal feed. The planning is deliberate. Households balance immediate needs against the likelihood of future scarcity, calculating how long stores must last and adjusting meals accordingly. There is no luxury, only survival through careful foresight. Observation and knowledge. The villagers rely on observation as much as physical labor. Cloud patterns, soil moisture, and wind direction are watched continuously. A single heavy storm can erode terraces or flood pools, while weeks without rain demand careful rationing and adaptation. Knowledge of the landscape is passed orally, generation to generation. The precise location of water pools, the most fertile terrace plots, and the safest grazing areas are all memorized and shared. This collective understanding underpins survival in a place where technology is minimal, but ingenuity is essential. The weight of uncertainty. Even with careful planning, uncertainty governs life. A poor rain season can reduce yields drastically. Extended droughts threaten livestock, soil stability, and the limited food stores. Villagers live with a constant awareness that the environment is fickle, and their survival depends on small, repeated acts of vigilance, adaptation, and conservation. An unresolved question. As you watch the sun set over the dry hills, lighting the stone walls in gold, one thought lingers. When survival depends on water that may never come, terraces that may erode, and pools that may dry, how much of human resilience is a matter of skill, and how much is patience waiting for the mercy of rain? You remain on the dry slopes of Anatolia as the months stretch into late spring, a period when rain is most needed but often least reliable. The villagers have prepared as best they can, terraces repaired, water pools maintained, and hardy crops sown. Yet, even with careful preparation, survival is a delicate negotiation with an unpredictable climate. Every day becomes a quiet exercise in observation, resource management, and patience. Watching the sky. From early morning, the villagers' eyes are drawn to the clouds. They observe subtle changes, shifts in color, formation, and movement. Even a slight breeze from the west is interpreted as a potential signal of rainfall. This constant vigilance is not idle curiosity, it is a survival strategy. A single unexpected storm could replenish pools and saturate terraces, or it could wash away the fragile soil, eroding months of careful labor. Knowledge of the land, accumulated over years, dictates how people respond, whether to move livestock, reinforce terraces, or adjust planting schedules. Managing the soil. Terraces are maintained continuously. Villagers patrol each strip of land, checking for erosion, loosening compacted soil, and adjusting walls and channels to direct any rainwater efficiently. Small depressions are created to capture runoff, and stones are repositioned to prevent damage during sudden downpours. Even when rain is absent, the work is deliberate. Loosening soil allows it to absorb moisture more effectively when it arrives, and maintaining walls prevents catastrophic loss during rare but intense storms. Each terrace reflects months of human effort, engineered to mediate between scarcity and survival. Crops in microclimates. Planting strategies are dictated by microclimates. You notice that villagers prioritize low depressions where water is likely to linger longer, while rockier, exposed terraces are reserved for more drought-tolerant crops or for grazing. Intercropping is common. Grains like wheat and barley are paired with legumes such as chickpeas to maximize limited soil nutrients and moisture. These combinations do not guarantee a full harvest, but they reduce the risk of total failure. Each choice reflects a calculated trade-off: yield versus stability, labor versus risk, survival versus surplus. Water as a central resource. The small rainwater pools remain under constant surveillance. Villagers measure water levels daily and monitor evaporation. Channels feeding the pools are cleared of debris to ensure that even the smallest rainfall is captured. Water is allocated strategically. Some goes to terraces, some to livestock, some is reserved for household use. A miscalculation could mean that crops wither or animals are left without forage, so these decisions are made with careful attention to timing and volume. Livestock management. Goats and sheep serve multiple purposes. They provide milk and meat, help manage vegetation, and generate dung for soil enrichment. Grazing is rotated among the hillsides to prevent overuse, and herding paths are carefully chosen to avoid trampling terraces or eroding soil near water pools. Even small adjustments in herding can have outsized effects. An overgrazed slope may not recover before the next planting season, reducing future food security. The villagers' attention to animals is as much about long-term sustainability as it is about immediate nutrition. Food preservation and rationing. Meals are simple and carefully measured. Grains and legumes are rationed to last until the next harvest, and storage containers, clay jars, elevated bins, or lofted granaries are monitored for pests and moisture. Even the byproducts of cooking, like husks or stems, are used as fertilizer or animal feed. These measures are not extreme, they are disciplined. Every household operates on a delicate balance, ensuring that nothing is wasted and that small reserves are maintained for emergencies. Community coordination. The village functions as an interconnected system. Families share knowledge about water collection, terrace repair, and planting techniques. Labor is sometimes pooled to reinforce walls or repair channels after storms. Yet exchanges of resources are measured because scarcity demands caution. Information flows through observation and oral tradition. If rainfall is reported in neighboring villages or mountains, this may influence local irrigation or planting decisions. The network of observation extends beyond the immediate community, creating a subtle system of regional intelligence about survival. The role of patience. Despite meticulous preparation, the villagers cannot force rain. Survival requires patience as much as labor. Weeks may pass without a drop of water, and the soil remains dry and unyielding. Yet, inaction is not despair, it is strategic waiting, informed by experience and observation. The villagers have learned to balance action with restraint. They reinforce terraces, maintain water pools, monitor crops, and care for livestock, all without exhausting their limited energy or depleting resources prematurely. A fragile season. By mid-spring, the plateau has not yet received significant rain. Crops remain alive but stressed. Terraces are intact but at risk from potential storms. Pools hold water but only in modest amounts. Every element of the ecosystem, soil, plants, water, animals, and human labor is interdependent. The villagers understand that success will not be dramatic. Yield will be modest. Survival is measured in incremental gains rather than abundance. An unanswered question. Standing on a hillside, watching small pools glint in the sunlight and terraces stretched across the dry slopes, one thought lingers. When survival depends on capturing what little water falls, managing soil and livestock carefully, and balancing labor with patience, how much of a year's outcome is controlled by human skill and how much by the mercy of the skies? You remain on the dry slopes of Anatolia as late spring merges into early summer. After weeks of careful observation, labor, and patient waiting, the villagers approach the moment when months of preparation will reveal the fruits or limits of their work. Survival here is measured not by abundance, but by the quiet success of sustaining life under harsh conditions. The arrival of rain. Finally, the rain comes sporadic and modest, never overwhelming but sufficient to wet terraces and refill small pools. The villagers respond immediately. Channels are cleared, terraces inspected, and water is carefully directed toward crops that have been struggling for weeks. Every drop is precious. The pools, once empty or nearly so, glisten again, offering temporary relief and the possibility of a modest harvest. Even the briefest shower triggers a series of coordinated actions. Terraces are reinforced where runoff threatens soil, livestock are guided toward areas that have retained moisture, and irrigation channels are adjusted to maximize reach. These small acts, though unremarkable, are the culmination of months of planning. Crops respond slowly. You walk among the terraces, observing grains bending faintly under the moisture and legumes pushing new shoots from dry, stressed soil. Growth is uneven. Low terraces benefit more than exposed ridges, and rockier plots show less improvement. Yet the modest rains are enough to sustain life and allow crops to continue maturing. Villagers adjust expectations. They know the harvest will be small, but it will prevent famine. They focus on nurturing what survives rather than lamenting what was lost. This pragmatic approach has defined centuries of life in these arid regions. Harvest preparations. As crops mature, careful attention is given to harvesting. Labor is prioritized. Adults work the terraces systematically, while children assist with lighter tasks like carrying harvested grains or gathering small amounts of forage for livestock. Each action is methodical, minimizing waste and ensuring that every stalk or pod contributes to survival. Granaries and storage pits are cleaned and readied. Clay jars are inspected, straw linings adjusted, and ventilation checked. These measures may seem mundane, but in this climate they are essential. Improper storage could undo months of labor in a single heat wave or pest infestation. Livestock and food security. Livestock, having survived the dry months with careful management, continue to provide milk and occasional meat. Grazing is rotated deliberately to prevent overuse of fragile pastures. Dung is collected and returned to terraces as fertilizer, sustaining soil fertility for the next planting season. The integration of livestock, soil, and crops demonstrates a subtle, long-term planning system. Survival is not merely a matter of immediate food, but of maintaining the balance of the ecosystem for future seasons. Social coordination. Throughout the harvest, the village operates as a cohesive network. Families exchange labor, share advice on irrigation adjustments, and offer limited support to those with weaker terraces or smaller water pools. Coordination is quiet and deliberate, guided by experience and shared necessity. Even in scarcity, social cohesion matters. Survival here depends not just on individual skill, but on the collective management of labor, water, and knowledge. The quiet triumph of planning. As you watch the villagers complete the harvest, the yield is modest but sufficient. Nothing about the result is dramatic. There are no celebrations, no surplus to sell, no visible signs of abundance. Yet the subtle triumph lies in the fact that everyone survives, and the terraces, pools, and knowledge persist into the next season. The success is cumulative. Months of patient observation, labor, and careful planning have mitigated environmental risk. The villagers' resilience is expressed not in bold acts but in countless small decisions, repeated steadily over time. Reflection on human resilience. Standing on the hillside, looking over terraces glistening from the rain, you realize that survival in these arid villages depends on a combination of skill, patience, and foresight. The villagers have engineered life into the landscape itself, creating modest but functional systems that capture water, conserve soil, and sustain crops and livestock. Here, resilience is quiet, deliberate, and uncelebrated, but no less remarkable. It is the steady accumulation of small, calculated acts that preserves life in a place where failure is always possible. An open-ended question. As the sun sets over the dry hills, illuminating the stone walls and rain-refilled pools, one question lingers. When survival hinges on subtle, continuous effort rather than abundance, what lessons can be drawn from those who endure in silence, balancing labor, knowledge, and patience against the uncertainty of nature itself? Story 7. The irrigation-free fields of ancient Mesopotamia. You find yourself in the plains of southern Mesopotamia, the land famously wedged between the Tigris River and Euphrates River. This region, often called the cradle of civilization, is not uniformly fertile. While the rivers provide water for certain areas, much of the land, especially the uplands and marginal fields, remains dry for extended periods. Here, long before the construction of elaborate canals and irrigation systems, farmers had to adapt to the challenges of moisture scarcity. Life on these fields is defined by timing, soil, and observation. Unlike in later centuries, when canals and channels could redistribute water, these early communities depended on rainfall, river overflows, and small natural depressions to sustain their crops. The soil and the crops. Walking across these ancient fields, you notice the variety of soils: darker alluvial plains near the river, sandy patches on the outskirts, and compact clay flats that retain little moisture. Each soil type demands different approaches. Seeds are chosen with care. Barley dominates, resilient to low water and capable of germinating quickly. Lentils and chickpeas are planted in small patches, tolerating drier areas while supplementing protein for the community. Flax is sometimes included, providing fiber for textiles but requiring careful placement in marginally moister soil. The seeds are scattered deliberately, often in small clusters, allowing farmers to test the soil's response and minimize total loss in case of drought. Rainfall as a governing force. Rainfall is the ultimate determinant of success. The seasonal patterns are brief and unpredictable. Farmers rely on subtle observation. The timing and direction of clouds. Early moisture in the soil, detected by touch or smell. Wind patterns that may indicate incoming storms. When rain arrives, even in small amounts, fields must be planted or tended immediately. Delay can reduce germination success, leaving seeds vulnerable to desiccation or predation. Every decision depends on rapid assessment and action. Natural water retention. In areas away from the rivers, farmers rely on depressions and small hollows that collect water temporarily. Shallow pits are dug to capture runoff from occasional rain, creating micro-irrigation zones. These depressions are simple yet effective, extending the life of crops that would otherwise wither. Even small adjustments like piling soil along the edge of a depression to slow runoff make a significant difference. Water is scarce, and even minor conservation measures determine whether families survive or struggle. Crop diversity as a risk buffer. Farmers deliberately mix crops in a single field. Barley may grow alongside chickpeas, lentils, and sometimes flax. This diversity ensures that if one crop fails due to insufficient water, another may survive. The practice is pragmatic rather than aesthetic. It reflects centuries of observation. Monocultures are vulnerable in a climate that is inconsistent and harsh. Crop selection is guided by drought tolerance, growth rate, and the nutritional needs of the community. The labor of early agriculture. Daily life is physically demanding. You see farmers tilling with simple wooden tools, loosening compacted soil to increase moisture absorption. Planting is careful and deliberate, with seeds spaced according to soil type and moisture retention. Children assist in light work, clearing debris, carrying water from small depressions, or tending young plants. Women manage food preparation, maintain stored grains, and monitor small livestock. Each task is small but collectively essential for survival. Livestock and land management. Sheep, goats, and small cattle serve multiple functions, providing milk and occasional meat, supplying dung for fertilizing fields, maintaining vegetation through grazing without exhausting fragile soils. Animals are moved between grazing areas carefully. Overgrazing can deplete the limited greenery, while undergrazing allows weeds and erosion to increase. Livestock are integrated into the agricultural system, reflecting a subtle balance between feeding people and preserving the land. Food storage and preservation. Once harvested, grains are stored in clay jars, granaries, or shallow pits, often covered with straw to prevent spoilage. Storage management is critical. Rain can seep into improperly covered containers, destroying seeds and food. Even pests are a threat. Careful observation and minor interventions like creating barriers or removing infested grain can prevent catastrophic loss. The emphasis on storage reflects an understanding of seasonal variability. Farmers know that the next period of rainfall may not come as expected, so careful rationing and preservation are central to survival. Community knowledge and coordination. Knowledge of soil, rainfall, and crop behavior is shared communally. Farmers exchange observations, coordinate planting strategies, and sometimes share tools. The community functions as a network of information and labor. Individual effort is essential, but collective awareness increases the chance of survival. Even minor innovations like adjusting seed depth or creating a small diversion for runoff spread quickly, enhancing the resilience of the community as a whole. The uncertainty of survival. Despite careful planning, survival is never guaranteed. Rain may fail, seeds may not germinate, and pests may destroy patches of crops. Every season carries uncertainty. Farmers must balance effort with patience, energy with observation, and hope with pragmatism. Walking across the fields, you see the land itself as both a resource and a challenge, shaping behavior, labor, and decision-making. Survival is an ongoing negotiation with nature, made delicate by the lack of technology and the unpredictability of water. An open-ended question. As you stand at the edge of the fields, feeling the dry clay underfoot and observing the shallow depressions collecting faint water from earlier rains, one question lingers. In a land where survival depends on tiny, unreliable amounts of water, what separates those who endure from those who fail, and how much is skill, observation, or simply the fortune of rainfall? You remain in the upland fields of Mesopotamia as the summer heat intensifies. Rain has been sparse, and the soil, though loosened and prepared, begins to crack in the sun. Farmers are acutely aware that these weeks before the occasional river overflow will determine whether their seeds survive, whether families will eat, and whether livestock will have forage. Observing the soil and crops. The villagers inspect the soil daily. Even small changes, slight cracking, color darkening, or the presence of moisture just below the surface signal potential success or failure. Farmers use sticks, hands, and intuition honed over years to judge whether planting needs adjustment or water harvesting measures should be intensified. Barley sprouts show signs of stress in exposed areas. Chickpeas and lentils, being slightly more drought-resistant, fare better, but the overall situation is tense. One patch can recover, while another, seemingly similar, fails completely. These inconsistencies demand careful attention and flexible management. Water conservation and microengineering. In the absence of canals, villagers rely on small-scale interventions to retain moisture. Shallow depressions collect runoff and focus it near young plants. Raised mounds prevent water from draining too quickly and shield roots from direct sunlight. Stone-lined channels divert even minimal rain toward vulnerable plots. These measures are subtle but effective. Each minor adjustment can determine whether a plot survives the dry spell or succumbs to desiccation. Labor prioritization. With water scarce, labor is carefully allocated. Adults focus on maintaining terraces, repairing small walls, and monitoring water collection pits. Children assist with light work, such as moving straw, clearing debris from channels, or checking stored grains. Women manage household food, cooking, and rationing, ensuring that energy and nutrition last through periods of scarcity. Labor is adaptive. If a small storm threatens to erode terraces, everyone shifts attention immediately. Flexibility and vigilance are as important as physical strength in sustaining the community. Livestock and resource management. Sheep and goats are crucial not only for nutrition, but also for maintaining ecological balance. Grazing is rotated to prevent overuse, and animals are guided to areas where water pools or residual greenery remain. Dung is collected meticulously to fertilize terraces, enhancing soil for future crops. The management of livestock reflects an understanding of long-term survival. It is not enough to feed animals today, they must remain viable to sustain human life through the next season. Food storage and rationing. Harvested grains and legumes are carefully monitored. Stored barley is checked for moisture and pests, while lentils and chickpeas are segregated to prevent spoilage. Meals are portioned conservatively, sometimes extending for days longer than would be typical in a wetter year. Even small adjustments in rationing can determine survival. The villagers understand that maintaining energy is critical, not only for physical work, but for the observation and intervention that sustain crops, water systems, and livestock. Knowledge transmission. Oral knowledge dominates survival strategies. Older villagers instruct younger ones on soil assessment, planting techniques, water retention methods, and crop rotation. This informal education ensures that hard-earned strategies are passed forward, increasing the resilience of the community. Innovations like adjusting planting depth, widening runoff channels, or lining pits with clay spread quickly. Each is tested in the field, modified, and incorporated into a growing body of practical knowledge. Community coordination. Families work in small, coordinated networks. Some assist with terrace maintenance, while others manage water pits or distribute labor during planting. Communication is quiet but constant, guided by mutual interest and necessity. Cooperation is pragmatic, balancing assistance with resource limitations. Even disagreements are tempered by shared awareness. A failed plot affects not only the household but the wider network. Social cohesion becomes an invisible but critical factor in survival. The mental weight of uncertainty. Even with careful management, uncertainty dominates daily life. One season can be relatively successful. The next can fail entirely due to insufficient rain, pest infestations, or unexpected soil collapse. Farmers experience a constant tension between hope and caution, planning meticulously while acknowledging forces beyond control. Survival is not heroic, it is an accumulation of small decisions, repeated carefully, day by day, with attention to detail and subtle observation. An unanswered question. As you walk across fields where barley bends faintly in the wind and chickpeas push stubbornly through dry soil, one question lingers. When survival is dictated by a landscape that offers only minimal water and unpredictable rains, how much of human endurance is determined by skill and planning, and how much by sheer fortune? You remain in the fields of Mesopotamia as late summer arrives, bringing with it the culmination of months of careful planning, observation, and labor. The sun beats down on terraces, shallow pits, and scattered plots, and the villagers approach the delicate moment of harvest. Success here is measured not by abundance, but by the quiet triumph of sustaining life in a landscape governed by scarcity. Harvesting grain carefully. The barley has ripened unevenly. Some patches are robust, while others are stunted. Farmers move deliberately, cutting stalks carefully to avoid damaging remaining seedlings. Harvesting is slow, meticulous work because every grain matters. Children assist by gathering cut stalks and carrying small bundles to drying areas. Women participate, ensuring that grains are stored safely in clay jars or lofted granaries. Even the placement of a single jar is strategic. It must be protected from pests, dampness, and heat. Every detail reflects months of accumulated knowledge about the land, climate, and crops. Managing scarce water and pools. Shallow water pits, which have served the crops throughout the dry season, are carefully emptied and their silt preserved. The collected sediment is sometimes mixed with compost to enrich terraces for the next planting. Even the act of removing water from pools is measured. Too much, and future grazing areas or remaining crops may suffer. Too little, and the stored water may stagnate or attract pests. Villagers treat water with the same deliberate attention as seed or grain, understanding its central role in survival. Livestock contributions. Sheep and goats continue to play a vital role. Milk is consumed or preserved in small quantities. Dung is returned to the terraces. Animals are kept on carefully rotated pastures to prevent overgrazing. Every action from feeding to herding contributes indirectly to the harvest. The ecosystem of people, crops, water, and livestock functions as an integrated survival system. A misstep in one component could cascade, threatening the delicate balance. Food storage and protection. Grains and legumes are stored in multiple locations: jars, pits, and granaries. Each container is inspected, lined with straw or clay to prevent pests and moisture, and placed to minimize exposure to heat or flooding. Families ration carefully, ensuring that stores last until the next planting season. This management reflects the awareness that survival is ongoing. Harvest is not merely a reward, it is preparation for the next period of scarcity. Community coordination and knowledge sharing. Even during harvest, families coordinate with neighbors. Labor is shared for moving heavy bundles, maintaining terraces, or protecting water channels. Advice on seed depth, pest management, and storage is passed quietly. The community functions as a network of knowledge and labor. Survival is individual in execution but collective in strategy. Every small action observing the soil, adjusting irrigation channels, rotating animals relies on shared understanding. The quiet triumph of skill. By the end of harvest, the yield is modest but sufficient. There is no abundance to celebrate, only the relief that families will survive. The triumph lies not in dramatic results, but in the steady application of observation, labor, and careful planning over months of uncertainty. The villagers have transformed the challenges of the landscape into manageable conditions through knowledge and patience. Success is measured in continued life rather than profit or surplus. Reflection on endurance. Standing on a ridge, watching the organized terraces, the shallow pools, and the careful activity of farmers and livestock, you realize that survival in Mesopotamia was never a simple matter of labor alone. It depended on observation of soil, weather, and plants, strategic planning of planting, irrigation, and labor, careful management of scarce resources, water, seeds, and livestock, collective knowledge, and subtle community coordination. Resilience here is quiet and cumulative, built over time through careful attention to small, interdependent factors. An open-ended question. As you leave the fields, nodding the dry earth cracked in some areas, the tiny pools sustaining life, and the subtle patterns of terraces, one thought lingers. When survival depends on skill, observation, and patience, how much of human endurance is determined by wisdom accumulated over generations, and how much remains at the mercy of chance, rain, and the unpredictable whims of nature? Story 8. The Highland Villages of Peru, Terraces Without Canals. You find yourself in the highlands of Peru, hundreds of meters above sea level, where thin air and steep slopes shape every aspect of daily life. Villages cling to terraces carved into mountainsides, their stone walls zigzagging across slopes that would otherwise be impossible to cultivate. Water is scarce, and the technology for large-scale irrigation has not yet arrived. Life depends on careful soil management, rainwater capture, and selecting crops that can survive the high-altitude climate. The terraces themselves are an architectural solution to survival. They prevent erosion, retain the thin topsoil, and create microclimates where moisture can linger. Each terrace is a small ecosystem, deliberately constructed to mediate between human needs and the harshness of the environment. The crops of the highlands. The villagers cultivate hardy crops suited to altitude and unpredictability. Potatoes, the staple of highland life, thrive even on rocky terraces. They are planted carefully, with spacing and soil depth calibrated to preserve moisture. Quinoa, resilient and drought-tolerant, supplements the diet with protein and seeds for storage. Oca and mashua, root vegetables, are rotated to maintain soil fertility and avoid depletion. Seed selection is meticulous. Farmers preserve seeds from the healthiest plants, ensuring genetic resilience. Each crop is planted with an eye toward survival rather than surplus. Terraces as water managers. Water is managed subtly. Rainwater is captured in depressions, stored in shallow channels, or allowed to seep slowly into terrace soils. The height, width, and slope of each terrace are chosen to maximize retention. Stones are arranged to minimize erosion, and terraces are reinforced where runoff is likely to be strongest. These terraces are not merely fields. They are an intricate system of water management. Even minor errors, a misplaced stone or improperly packed soil, can result in water loss, reduced fertility, and lower yields. The villagers' attention to detail is essential for life. Daily life on the slopes. Life on the terraces is physically demanding. Farmers walk narrow paths, carrying tools, soil amendments, or harvested crops. The work is deliberate. Planting requires precise spacing, soil loosening, and gentle handling of fragile seedlings. Women manage household stores, prepare meals, and tend small livestock such as guinea pigs, which provide protein without large water requirements. Children participate early, learning to balance labor with observation, and to notice subtle signs of soil health, moisture, and plant growth. Soil fertility and labor. Soil is thin and easily exhausted. Villagers use compost, organic matter, and sometimes ash to replenish nutrients. Terraces require continuous maintenance, reinforcing walls, adding soil, and redistributing nutrients. The labor is constant but measured. Every action from loosening soil to adding a handful of compost is designed to maximize long-term survival rather than immediate yield. Harvesting and storage. Potatoes and quinoa are harvested carefully. Tubers are inspected and stored in elevated, ventilated areas to prevent rot. Seeds are saved for the next planting season, sometimes rotated between terraces to maintain soil fertility. Food management is conservative. Meals are rationed to ensure energy for work and to preserve stores through dry periods. Even the husks and inedible parts of crops are repurposed as compost or animal feed. Community knowledge. Knowledge is shared communally. Experienced villagers teach younger generations how to construct terraces, manage soil, and capture rainwater efficiently. Oral traditions guide planting schedules, water distribution, and the careful rotation of crops. Innovations like new stone arrangements or micropools are tested and incorporated into communal practice. Survival is therefore both individual and collective. Each household depends on its own labor and judgment, but knowledge circulates within the village, creating subtle social cohesion. The challenge of scarcity. Even with meticulous planning, life is precarious. Rainfall may be insufficient, pests can attack crops, and terraces can fail under heavy runoff. Every season carries uncertainty. Villagers live with constant awareness that the delicate balance between labor, soil, water, and climate governs survival. An unresolved question. Standing on the terraces, gazing across the patchwork of stone walls and crops, one thought lingers. When survival depends on careful management of soil, water, and crops on unforgiving slopes, how much of human endurance is determined by planning and knowledge, and how much is left to chance, weather, and the fragility of life at high altitude? You remain on the Andean slopes as the early rainy season approaches. The terraces, carefully constructed over generations, are ready, but survival depends on more than preparation. Water is scarce and inconsistent, soil is thin and prone to erosion, and crops, while hardy, are vulnerable to both drought and sudden storms. Life here is defined by patience, labor, and constant observation. Monitoring rain and soil. Villagers check terraces daily, observing subtle changes in soil moisture. The first damp spots indicate where water has seeped from recent rainfall or melting snow. Crops are monitored carefully. Potato sprouts are checked for wilting, quinoa leaves for discoloration, and soil for compacted patches that may prevent water absorption. Even minor adjustments can make a difference. Small furrows are dug to channel water to struggling plants, stones are repositioned to slow runoff, and terraces are lightly compacted to conserve moisture. These are quiet, unremarkable acts, but in this environment, they are the difference between survival and failure. Livestock and labor balance. Sheep, llamas, and guinea pigs are tended alongside crops. Livestock provide protein, wool, and dung for fertilization, but they must not overgraze fragile slopes. Grazing is rotated carefully. Animals are moved to higher or lower terraces depending on vegetation and water availability. Human labor is allocated with equal care. Adults focus on terraces, water management, and crop maintenance. Children carry small loads, herd animals, and assist with water channels. Women oversee food preparation and storage, ensuring that meals sustain energy for ongoing labor. The distribution of work is deliberate, designed to maximize efficiency without exhausting limited energy reserves. Managing microclimates. Terraces create microclimates, slightly warmer or moister zones, depending on orientation and elevation. Villagers understand these subtle variations and use them strategically. Potato varieties that require more moisture are planted in lower terraces where runoff collects. Quinoa, more drought-tolerant, grows on higher or rockier terraces. Soil amendments are distributed according to terrace exposure and nutrient retention. Observation guides planting decisions, and adjustments are continuous. A terrace that appears healthy one week may require reinforcement or supplemental water the next. Water capture and distribution. Shallow channels and small pools capture rainwater efficiently. Villagers monitor evaporation, rainfall, and seepage constantly. When water levels drop, crops and animals are prioritized carefully. Even small quantities of water are rationed, emphasizing long-term survival over immediate convenience. Some villagers adjust terraces subtly during the season, adding small mounds, lining channels with stones, or creating mini depressions to slow water loss. These minor interventions are cumulative, ensuring that even scarce rainfall benefits crops fully. Food rationing and storage. Stored potatoes and grains are managed meticulously. Tubers are inspected daily, seeds sorted for viability, and granaries checked for pests or dampness. Meals are rationed, and food is supplemented with limited livestock products. Nothing is wasted. Even peelings or husks are repurposed for compost or animal feed. The careful balance between consumption and conservation reflects an understanding of future scarcity. Villagers know that today's decisions affect survival for the next season. Social coordination and knowledge sharing. Families work together to maintain terraces, share water management strategies, and advise on pest control. Knowledge is passed orally, with younger villagers learning by observing elders and participating in subtle but critical tasks. Small innovations, like adjusting the slope of a terrace or changing the location of a mini pool, spread quietly but quickly throughout the village. Survival is therefore both individual and collective. Each household depends on its own labor but benefits from shared wisdom and coordinated effort. The uncertainty of survival. Despite careful observation, labor, and planning, uncertainty dominates life. Sudden storms can wash away terraces, prolonged dry periods can stress crops, and pests can reduce yields. Every season carries risk, and villagers live with the constant awareness that their delicate ecosystem is fragile. Patience, vigilance, and continuous adaptation define existence. The work may seem repetitive or dull, but it is vital. Small actions accumulate into survival. An unresolved question. Standing on the terraces, watching the first signs of green shoots emerging and listening to the quiet wind over stone walls, one thought lingers. When survival depends on subtle interventions, careful observation, and patient labor, how much of human endurance is a product of knowledge and preparation, and how much remains at the mercy of the environment's unpredictability? You remain on the Andean terraces as late summer turns toward early autumn. Months of labor, observation, and patience culminate in the harvest, the moment when survival strategies are tested. The terraces, stone walls, and carefully managed water channels have all contributed to the outcome. Yet, in these highlands, success is measured quietly by the ability to sustain life through scarcity rather than by abundance. Harvesting the tubers. Potatoes, the backbone of highland life, are harvested methodically. Villagers work slowly, carefully lifting tubers to avoid damage. Even minor bruises are noted, as damaged potatoes spoil faster in storage. Children assist by gathering smaller tubers, learning the skill of selecting healthy specimens for consumption and seed saving. Quinoa and other root crops are harvested simultaneously. Plants are pulled gently to preserve the soil structure of terraces. Every action reflects months of accumulated experience, each movement calibrated to minimize loss and maximize the potential of a modest yield. Storage and preservation. After harvest, food is stored strategically. Potatoes are kept in ventilated lofts or clay-lined pits, ensuring they remain dry and protected from pests. Seeds for the next season are sorted and reserved, while surplus is rationed for daily consumption. Even the husks and non-edible plant parts are repurposed as compost or animal feed. These small, meticulous practices sustain both soil fertility and the next cycle of planting, demonstrating that survival is as much about future planning as present consumption. Managing water and livestock. Shallow water channels and pools, which have sustained crops during the dry months, are carefully maintained even during harvest. Soil sediment from pools is saved to enrich terraces, and any remaining water is rationed for livestock. Sheep, llamas, and guinea pigs provide protein, fertilizer, and occasional transport of harvested crops. Grazing is rotated, ensuring animals do not strip the fragile vegetation that protects soil on steep terraces. The integration of livestock and agriculture forms a subtle, continuous system where each component supports the others. Community coordination. Harvesting is coordinated across households. Families assist neighbors with heavy lifting, terrace maintenance, or water channel repairs. Knowledge is exchanged: which terraces yielded best, how to adjust planting depth, or how to reinforce walls for the next rainy season. Cooperation is measured. Scarcity limits the capacity for generosity, but shared labor and information enhance collective resilience. The community functions as a network, each household reinforcing the other's survival chances. Reflection on quiet resilience. By the end of the harvest, the yield is sufficient but modest. There is no celebration or surplus, only the relief of knowing that families will survive until the next planting season. The true accomplishment lies not in abundance, but in the cumulative effect of careful planning, observation, and labor over months. The villagers' resilience is quiet and deliberate. They do not rely on luck alone. They shape the land, capture water, rotate crops, and manage livestock with careful attention. Each season is a testament to the human ability to endure under environmental constraints. An open-ended question. Standing on the terraces, gazing at stone walls, green shoots, and shallow water channels reflecting sunlight, one thought lingers. When survival depends on meticulous labor, patient observation, and subtle adjustments, what defines resilience? Human skill, communal knowledge, or the unpredictable mercy of nature itself? Story 9. The arid plains of sub-Saharan Africa, sorghum and ingenious storage. You find yourself in the vast plains of sub-Saharan Africa, where the sun dominates the sky for months at a time, and rainfall is unpredictable. Villages are scattered, often built near small seasonal rivers or depressions that hold water briefly after the rains. Life here is dictated by cycles of scarcity and abundance, and survival requires careful planning, attentive observation, and ingenious methods of storing food and water. The people here rely on crops suited to the climate. Chief among them is sorghum, a grain resilient to drought and capable of surviving long dry periods. Sorghum forms the foundation of both food and cultural practices, but it demands careful management from planting to storage. Without irrigation, every stage requires meticulous labor and vigilance. Preparing the land. Fields are cleared and tilled before the rains, often by hand or with simple wooden hoes. Farmers work collectively in small groups, ensuring that the limited arable land is fully prepared. Soil is compacted lightly in some areas to retain moisture, while small depressions are created to capture runoff during the sporadic rains. The choice of planting site is strategic. Low-lying areas capture more water, but may also be prone to flooding or pest invasion. Higher, drier areas are safer but require sorghum varieties adapted to drought. Each decision reflects accumulated knowledge about microclimates, soil behavior, and rainfall patterns. Planting sorghum. Sorghum seeds are planted in carefully spaced rows or small clusters. Farmers pay attention to depth and soil compaction. Too shallow, and seeds dry out; too deep, and they may fail to germinate. Timing is critical. Planting too early risks seeds failing if the rains do not arrive. Too late and crops may not mature before the dry season sets in. Villagers often plant multiple varieties of sorghum to hedge against uncertainty. Some varieties germinate quickly, providing early yields, while others mature slowly but are more resilient to late-season drought. This crop diversity is a practical response to environmental unpredictability. Water conservation strategies. Even without irrigation, villagers capture and conserve water. Small channels and shallow pits redirect runoff from rare storms into fields, while terraces or bunds prevent topsoil erosion and maximize moisture retention. Mulch from grass or crop residues is spread around seedlings to reduce evaporation. Every intervention is small but deliberate. The goal is not to transform the landscape, but to optimize the limited rainfall for survival. Even minor miscalculations, misplaced furrows, or gaps in mulch can significantly impact yield. Labor and daily life. Labor is distributed across the community. Adults focus on planting, weeding, and monitoring soil, while children carry small loads, water animals, and assist in seed collection. Women manage household tasks, prepare food, and monitor stored grains. Each person's contribution is interconnected with the environment and community. A lapse in one area, neglected soil, unmonitored seed, or unmanaged livestock can jeopardize survival. Food storage and pest management. Once harvested, sorghum must be dried, stored, and protected from pests such as insects and rodents. Grains are often kept in clay pots, woven baskets, or elevated granaries with ventilation. Some communities mix ash or chaff with stored grain to deter pests. Monitoring continues throughout the dry season. Even a minor infestation can reduce vital food stores dramatically. Rationing begins early. Meals are carefully portioned to maintain energy for labor while conserving supplies. Nothing is wasted, and even byproducts like husks or stems are recycled into fuel, fodder, or compost. Community knowledge and coordination. Knowledge of soil, weather, crop varieties, and storage techniques is shared orally. Older villagers teach the young to read clouds, assess soil moisture, and identify subtle signs of pest invasion. Innovations, such as new storage methods or improved soil bunds, are shared widely, creating a network of practical survival knowledge. The community operates as a cooperative system. Individual labor is crucial, but collective knowledge ensures that everyone's survival is enhanced. The constant weight of scarcity. Even with preparation, life is uncertain. Rainfall may fail, pests may attack, and wind can erode exposed soil. Every action is tempered by awareness of fragility. Survival is an ongoing negotiation with an environment that offers both bounty and threat in unpredictable measure. Patience, observation, and careful labor define daily life. Every small effort, adjusting furrows, adding mulch, inspecting granaries, cumulatively determines the outcome of the season. An open-ended question. As you stand on the flat plains, watching the faint glimmer of water in seasonal depressions and the emerging green of sorghum seedlings, one thought lingers. When survival depends on capturing minimal rainfall, selecting resilient crops, and storing them against pests and heat, how much of human endurance is determined by ingenuity, planning, and knowledge, and how much remains at the mercy of the environment? You remain on the sun-scorched plains of sub-Saharan Africa as the dry season stretches onward. The small sorghum fields, carefully planted, depend entirely on sporadic rainfall and subtle conservation techniques. Life here is defined by constant observation, patient labor, and precise management of scarce resources. Every day brings decisions that can influence the survival of families through the coming months. Observing the soil and plants. Villagers monitor the soil and crops vigilantly. Cracks in the earth indicate extreme dryness, while slight darkening signals retained moisture. Sorghum seedlings are observed daily. Leaves that curl or discolor are indicators of stress, and farmers respond immediately by redirecting runoff or adding mulch. Even minor variations in growth matter. Some seedlings may thrive in microdepressions where water accumulates, while others on higher ground struggle. Farmers must constantly assess and adjust to these subtle differences, acting with a precision born of experience. Managing water without canals. Water capture remains central to survival. Shallow pits, bunds, and small furrows are inspected and repaired. Channels redirect rare rainfall to thirsty plants, and soil is carefully loosened to increase absorption. Evaporation is minimized using mulch or leaf litter, while terraces or small ridges prevent runoff from washing away fertile topsoil. Each intervention is small, unassuming, but crucial. The villagers' expertise lies in optimizing natural processes rather than imposing elaborate technology. They work in concert with the land, adjusting incrementally to environmental conditions. Labor allocation. Labor is distributed deliberately. Adults perform the most demanding tasks, loosening soil, repairing bunds, and monitoring crops. Children assist by carrying water, collecting mulch, and tending small livestock. Women oversee household duties, food preparation, and the inspection of stored grains. This division of labor is strategic. Every person contributes to survival in ways that balance physical capability, environmental need, and household priorities. Livestock as a survival factor. Goats, sheep, and occasionally cattle are integrated into daily life. They provide milk, meat, and manure for fertilization, but grazing must be carefully managed to prevent overuse of fragile grasses. Rotational grazing allows vegetation to recover and maintains ecological balance. Animals also serve as an indirect water buffer. Grazing in areas near residual water pools ensures their survival while conserving scarce moisture for crops. The interplay of livestock and field management reflects a sophisticated understanding of limited resources. Food storage and vigilance. Grains are continuously monitored for pests, moisture, and spoilage. Clay jars, granaries, and woven baskets are checked daily, and preventive measures like adding ash or separating grains reduce the risk of losses. Meals are rationed to preserve stored food while maintaining energy for labor. Even minor lapses can have major consequences. An unnoticed infestation or damp granary can jeopardize months of careful planting and harvesting. Constant vigilance is not optional. It is essential to survival. Community knowledge and coordination. Oral knowledge guides every decision. Elders teach younger villagers how to read the land, anticipate rainfall, and detect early signs of crop stress. Innovations like small water channels, improved storage containers, or optimized planting patterns spread quickly through communal networks. The community functions as a cooperative system. Each household depends on its own labor, but collective observation, advice, and coordination increase everyone's chance of enduring the dry season. The mental weight of scarcity. Despite careful management, uncertainty dominates. Rain may fail, pests may invade, or wind may erode soil. Every day requires small acts of labor and observation, yet outcomes remain largely beyond complete human control. Life here is a slow, continuous negotiation with nature. Patience, foresight, and careful labor are more valuable than physical strength alone. Survival is built on a mosaic of minor, deliberate interventions. An unresolved question. Standing on the sun-bleached plains, observing sorghum sprouts stretching toward the sky in shallow depressions holding precious water, one thought lingers. When survival depends on constant vigilance, labor, and subtle interventions, how much of human endurance is skill and planning, and how much remains subject to chance, climate, and the unpredictable rhythms of nature? You remain on the arid plains as the dry season slowly yields to the brief rains that signal harvest time. The months of labor, observation, and patience culminate in gathering the sorghum, a modest but vital yield that sustains the village through the next months of scarcity. Survival here is quiet, measured in careful management and incremental success rather than abundance or celebration. Harvesting with care. Sorghum stalks are cut systematically, with attention to preserving grains and avoiding damage. Villagers work deliberately, moving slowly across plots to ensure that every seed is collected. Children assist by carrying small bundles, learning the critical skill of distinguishing healthy grain from damaged or infested stalks. The work is unglamorous but essential. One misstep, crushed stalks, spilled grains, or missed seeds could compromise food security for the coming months. Each action, however mundane, is significant. Storage and preservation. Harvested grains are dried thoroughly before storage. Clay jars, granaries, and woven baskets are inspected, cleaned, and prepared. Ash or chaff may be added to deter pests, and elevated storage prevents moisture damage. Seeds intended for the next planting season are carefully set aside. Even after storage, vigilance continues. Minor infestations or dampness are corrected immediately, as small mistakes can cascade into catastrophic losses. Conservation is continuous. The goal is not merely to harvest, but to ensure survival through the entire dry season. Livestock and ecosystem management. Goats, sheep, and other small animals continue to play a vital role. Milk and meat supplement the grain diet, while manure enriches terraces and plots for the next planting. Grazing is rotated carefully to prevent overuse of fragile vegetation and to preserve soil integrity. The interaction between livestock, soil, crops, and water channels is subtle but essential. Each component supports the others, forming an integrated system that balances scarcity and survival. Community coordination. Harvesting, storage, and labor are coordinated across households. Families assist neighbors with heavy work, share advice on terrace maintenance or pest control, and observe each other's practices to adopt improvements. Collective knowledge spreads quietly, reinforcing survival strategies throughout the village. Even disputes are tempered by necessity. A failure in one household may ripple across the community. Cooperation is pragmatic and ensures that collective resilience is maintained. Reflection on quiet resilience. By the end of harvest, the yield is modest but sufficient. There is no abundance to celebrate, no dramatic victory, only the quiet relief that families will endure the dry season. The true achievement lies in the steady, patient accumulation of knowledge, observation, and labor over months of environmental uncertainty. Resilience in these plains is deliberate, incremental, and largely unremarkable in outward appearance. Yet it is profound. Life is sustained, knowledge is preserved, and the subtle interplay between humans, land, and livestock continues into the next season. An open-ended question. As you observe the golden grains in clay jars, shallow water channels, and the rotating herds of goats and sheep, one thought lingers. When survival depends on vigilance, careful planning, and small, continuous actions, what defines human resilience? Innate skill, learned knowledge, communal cooperation, or the unpredictable mercy of the natural world? Story 10. The steppe herds of Central Asia, nomadic life without irrigation. You find yourself on the vast, windswept steppes of Central Asia, where grasslands stretch uninterrupted to the horizon. Rivers are rare, rainfall is minimal, and permanent settlements are scarce. Here, survival is less about cultivating the soil and more about understanding the land, managing herds, and following seasonal cycles. Irrigation is non-existent, yet nomadic communities have thrived for centuries by adapting to scarcity and mobility. The daily rhythm is dictated by livestock: horses, sheep, goats, and camels. These animals provide milk, meat, and transport, and their grazing patterns shape human movement. Nomads observe the land closely, noting where grasses are healthiest, where water collects after rains, and how snowmelt will replenish streams. Mobility is the central strategy. People follow the environment rather than attempting to reshape it. Herding as survival. Herds are carefully managed. Goats and sheep graze selectively, preserving grasses that regenerate quickly. Horses and camels are moved according to seasonal pastures, balancing access to nutrition with the long-term sustainability of the land. Each species serves multiple purposes: milk for sustenance, dung for fuel, and in some cases, wool or hides for clothing and trade. Herders monitor not only the animal's health, but also their impact on the steppe ecosystem. Overgrazing in one area can reduce forage for months. Undergrazing allows invasive plants or erosion to spread. This delicate balance is a constant concern. Water and mobility. Without irrigation, water is perhaps the most critical factor. Nomads rely on rivers, seasonal ponds, and snowmelt. Knowledge of water sources is passed orally through generations, often encoded in seasonal migration routes and landmarks. Mobility allows communities to exploit sparse resources without exhausting any single area. Water management is subtle. Temporary corrals are set near streams, small troughs are dug to extend access, and livestock are rotated to prevent trampling riparian zones. Each movement is planned to maximize efficiency and minimize risk to both animals and soil. Food and storage. Food for humans and animals is planned carefully. Milk and dairy products are preserved through fermentation or drying, creating portable, long-lasting nutrition. Grain, when carried, is stored in small quantities and protected from pests and moisture. Surplus meat is dried or smoked for periods of scarcity. Even minor miscalculations carrying too little water, overestimating forage, or misjudging travel time can have significant consequences. Survival relies on foresight and meticulous attention to the environment. Daily life and labor division. Daily life is organized around herd management, camp setup, and observation. Men often lead grazing routes and monitor distant water sources, while women manage food preparation, dairy processing, and childcare. Children participate from a young age, learning the rhythms of migration, herd behavior, and environmental cues. Work is continuous but measured. Every task contributes to survival. Adjusting tents against wind, preparing milk products, or repairing harnesses are all small yet critical acts that support the community. Community knowledge and oral tradition. Knowledge of pasture quality, migration routes, and seasonal timing is transmitted orally. Elders instruct the young on recognizing subtle signs in grass, soil, and weather that indicate water availability or forage health. Misreading these cues can be disastrous. This knowledge is cumulative. Minor innovations or adjustments like new grazing rotations, temporary enclosures, or water capture techniques spread through observation and shared experience. The network of wisdom ensures collective survival without written records or formal systems. The weight of uncertainty. Even with careful observation and planning, uncertainty dominates life. Seasonal snow may fail, rainfall may be delayed, or drought may deplete pastures faster than expected. Every day requires vigilance, labor, and adaptability. The environment is the ultimate arbiter of success or failure. Survival is measured not by excess but by continuity. Keeping herds healthy, water sources sufficient, and food stores adequate until the next seasonal opportunity. An open-ended question. As you watch herders guiding animals across the seemingly endless steppe, with distant hills marking temporary water sources, one thought lingers. When life is dictated by mobility, scarce water, and delicate ecosystems, what separates those who endure from those who fail? Is it knowledge, careful planning, communal coordination, or sheer fortune in a harsh landscape? You remain on the vast Central Asian steppe as the summer sun intensifies, illuminating the waves of grass stretching to the horizon. Life here is defined by motion. Unlike settled agricultural communities, these nomads rely on mobility, observation, and subtle environmental management to survive in a land where rainfall is minimal and water sources are ephemeral. Tracking pastures and water. Herders constantly observe the land. Grass color, texture, and growth patterns indicate soil fertility and moisture levels. Seasonal ponds and streams are monitored for depth and reliability, often by sending scouts ahead of the main herd. Even small depressions that retain water after brief rains become strategic points for grazing and rest. This observation is not casual, it is systematic. Patterns of wind, cloud formations, and snowmelt guide decisions. Misreading a pasture's health or a water source can jeopardize both livestock and human survival. Knowledge accumulated over generations informs every choice. Herd management. Livestock are carefully rotated across pastures. Sheep and goats graze selectively, leaving faster-growing grasses to recover, while horses and camels consume different plants, reducing competition. Herd sizes are monitored meticulously. Too many animals in one area risk overgrazing, while too few may compromise future reproduction and milk production. Animals are treated as both sustenance and assets. Milk is consumed or preserved, wool is used for clothing or trade, and dung is collected for fuel. Every part of the animal is utilized, reflecting an intimate understanding of limited resources. Temporary camps and labor division. Camps are established near water sources or fertile grazing areas. Tents are erected and oriented to shield occupants from prevailing winds, while livestock enclosures protect animals from predators. Labor is distributed efficiently. Men lead herds, check distant water sources, and repair fences or harnesses. Women manage food preparation, preserve milk products, and tend to children. Older children learn by assisting and observing daily routines. Tasks are repetitive but essential, forming a rhythm that synchronizes human labor with the steppes' ecological cycles. Vigilance, not speed, is prized. Food preservation and planning. Milk and meat are preserved using traditional methods. Fermentation, drying, and smoking allow food to last through long dry periods. Grain, when carried along migration routes, is stored carefully in containers resistant to moisture and pests. Every ration is calculated to maintain energy without exhausting reserves prematurely. Planning extends to contingencies. Knowledge of alternative water sources, emergency grazing areas, and portable feed ensures that herders can respond to unexpected shortages or delays. Community knowledge and coordination. Nomadic life relies heavily on shared knowledge. Elders instruct the young on herd behavior, seasonal migration, and environmental indicators. Decisions are often made collectively, with experienced voices guiding movement, water use, and pasture selection. Even subtle innovations like temporary corrals, portable troughs, or adjustments in migration timing spread quickly through observation and oral instruction, increasing the resilience of the group without requiring written records or formal management structures. The psychological weight of uncertainty. Despite careful observation, labor, and planning, the environment remains unpredictable. Drought, sudden storms, or overgrazed pastures can compromise survival. Each day requires attention to multiple variables: herd health, water availability, pasture quality, and food stores. Survival is a slow accumulation of careful choices rather than dramatic acts. The nomads' resilience is continuous, understated, and rooted in experience and foresight. An unresolved question. Watching the herders guide animals across the horizon, scanning for faint signs of water and assessing the grass, one thought lingers. When survival depends on mobility, observation, and subtle management of animals and land, what determines human endurance, knowledge, and skill, communal coordination, or the unpredictable whims of nature? You remain on the endless Central Asian steppe as late summer slowly gives way to the cooler winds of early autumn. For the nomads, survival is not marked by a harvest of crops but by the health of livestock, the adequacy of water, and the community's readiness for the coming season. Each year, mobility, observation, and careful management determine whether the village endures or falters. Managing herds during scarcity. By now, herders have guided animals across the steppe for months. Strategic grazing ensures that pastures are not exhausted and that each species finds adequate nutrition. Goats and sheep provide milk, which is consumed fresh or preserved through drying and fermentation. Horses and camels, essential for transportation and trade, are monitored carefully for signs of stress. Rotation continues as water sources dwindle. Small pools, ephemeral ponds, and snowmelt trickles are maximized through careful scheduling. Livestock that cannot be supported are sold, traded, or consumed strategically to maintain the overall health of the herd. Every decision balances immediate survival with long-term resilience. Food preservation and storage. Dairy products are transformed into cheese, yogurt, or dried curds, providing portable nutrition. Meat is dried or smoked for periods when grazing is insufficient or water is scarce. Grain, sometimes carried from small plots or purchased through trade, is stored carefully in waterproof containers, elevated from the ground, and monitored for pests. Food management reflects foresight. Even minor miscalculations, overconsumption, or spoilage can compromise the survival of families through the next months of scarcity. Community coordination and knowledge transfer. Migration routes, water sources, and pasture health are managed collectively. Elders guide decisions, drawing on decades of accumulated experience. Oral knowledge passes continuously. Children learn to read the land, anticipate water availability, and understand subtle cues in animal behavior. Minor innovations like temporary corrals, improved watering points, or adjusted migration timing spread across the steppe quietly but effectively. Knowledge ensures continuity. Survival depends not just on labor but on accumulated wisdom shared among the group. The role of observation. Observation is constant and deliberate. Grass color, soil moisture, animal behavior, and distant weather patterns all inform decisions. Misjudgment can result in overgrazed land, dehydration of animals, or inadequate food supplies. This quiet vigilance is the essence of nomadic resilience. Unlike settled agricultural communities, survival here does not rely on controlling water or planting crops, but on attentive adaptation to constantly changing conditions. Reflection on endurance. By the end of the migratory cycle, herds are healthy, families are nourished, and the knowledge of survival has been passed to the next generation. There is no dramatic triumph, only the quiet success of enduring another season in a harsh and unpredictable environment. The nomads. Resilience is subtle, cumulative, and rooted in the interplay between observation, skill, communal coordination, and adaptation to natural cycles. Survival is a living system, dependent on continuous care and awareness. An open-ended question. As you watch herders guiding animals across the steppe, tracing faint paths through grasses that bend in the wind, one thought lingers. When survival depends on constant observation, careful movement, and subtle management of land and animals, what ultimately defines human endurance skill, collective wisdom, patience, or the unpredictable forces of nature?